Tonight we stand beside a fragment of Cla that has survived longer than kingdoms, languages, and nearly every name once spoken around it. The object itself appears modest, small enough to rest in human hands, yet the story pressed into its surface reaches toward an age that Mesopotamian scribes believed existed before the Great Flood. Scholars working with collections in Oxford and other major institutions have studied versions of this tradition for generations, comparing signs, damaged lines, and later copies. What emerges is not a simple list of rulers. It is a memory of kingship descending from heaven, followed by 8 extraordinary rulers whose combined reigns stretch across more than 200,000 years. The numbers are so immense that even ancient chronology seems to loosen around them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and wherever you're listening tonight. Perhaps from a quiet room, a distant city, or somewhere beneath a completely different sky, post your location and your local time. You can imagine the tablet resting beneath low lamplight, while a scribe bends carefully over wet clay. The room smells of dust, reed fibres, and faint smoke from burning oil. His stylus presses small wedges into the surface, one patient mark following another. He is not writing a story in the way you might expect. He is preserving order. Names, cities, reigns, and transitions appear in a sequence that seems almost administrative. That calm presentation makes the strange material more powerful. Nothing in the tone warns you that the rulers being recorded supposedly governed for tens of thousands of years. The scribe simply continues. To him, these figures belong to a sacred past that demands careful transmission. The surviving tradition is commonly called the Sumerian king list, though the text reached us through several copies created at different times. Archaeologists have recovered versions from ancient Mesopotamian sites, and researchers have spent decades reconstructing how those copies relate to one another. One famous manuscript, preserved in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, contains a particularly extensive version of the sequence. Its existence gives historians something more substantial than a later legend repeated through oral tradition. Clay remembers pressure remarkably well. Once fired or hardened, even accidental destruction can preserve a written surface for thousands of years. It is one of history's quiet jokes that fire can sometimes save what it appears to destroy. The sequence begins with an idea that would have felt natural within ancient Mesopotamian religion. Kingship does not gradually emerge from farming villages, political negotiations, or ambitious families. Kingship descends from heaven. The statement is brief, almost ceremonial, but its implications are enormous. Authority arrives from somewhere beyond ordinary human society. It is granted rather than invented. The first city associated with this divine kingship is Eridu, one of the earliest major settlements in southern Mesopotamia. Archaeological excavations have shown that Eridu possessed a long religious history, with temple buildings repeatedly rebuilt upon the remains of earlier sacred structures. You move in your mind across that Agimli, that vanished landscape. The air is hot and dry, though wetlands spread through parts of the southern plain. Reeds sway near water channels. Insects hum above shallow pools, and distant birds disturb the evening silence. Mud brick walls rise from ground that seems almost level with the horizon. There are no towering stone monuments here. Timber is scarce, stone rarer still, and much of civilization is built from earth shaped by human hands. Yet within this fragile architecture, people construct a remarkably durable vision of the universe. Heaven stands above, the underworld lies beneath. Gods govern forces that human beings cannot control. Rivers flood, harvests fail, children are born as storms arrive, and rulers claim legitimacy beneath divine eyes. The first king named in Eridu is Alulim, His reign is given as 28,800 years. Another ruler, Alalgar, follows with 36,000 years. These are not ordinary dynastic numbers inflated by a few generations, they belong to a different scale entirely. A single reign exceeds the span separating many modern nations from the earliest cities. Taken literally, such ages defy everything known about human biology. Taken symbolically, they still demand explanation. Scholars have proposed numerical system, literary symbolism, scribal convention, theological meaning, and political design. No single interpretation has ended the discussion. This is where the mystery becomes more delicate. Ancient texts often combine material that modern readers prefer to separate into history, religion, mythology, genealogy, and political ideology. The scribes did not necessarily recognize those boundaries in the same way. A king could be historical and sacred. A city could exist physically while also carrying cosmic significance. A flood could preserve memories of real disasters while becoming part of a theological account about divine judgment. The categories overlap. That makes the tablet frustrating for anyone seeking a clean answer, but wonderfully revealing for anyone willing to remain uncertain. One curious detail deepens that uncertainty. Some names associated with the earliest rulers seem less like ordinary personal names, and more like relics from a mythic vocabulary whose original meanings are difficult to recover completely. Language changes, scribal traditions shift, and older material can survive long after its first context has disappeared. By the time later scribes copied these lists, they may already have been handling traditions that felt ancient to them. Imagine copying a document whose first version was already older than your grandparents' legends. Now imagine generations repeating that process. The result becomes layered memory rather than straightforward record. Researchers at institutions such as Oxford and Yale have long treated Mesopotamian king lists as important evidence for understanding ancient political thought. The text cannot simply be read as a modern chronological table. Some rulers from later portions can be connected with historical dynasties, while earlier figures belong far more clearly to legendary time. That combination is significant. The list does not abruptly announce that myth has ended and history has begun. Instead, impossible reigns slowly give way to shorter and more recognizable ones. Mythic time seems to narrow until it resembles human time. That gradual narrowing matters because it suggests structure. The 8 primeval rulers are not scattered randomly through unrelated stories. They form part of an ordered sequence connected with specific cities before the flood. Their reigns are measured, their places are named, their authority belongs within a system. Whatever the original intention, the scribes wanted these rulers remembered together. They appear as guardians of an age in which human kingship remains unusually close to divine authority. Modern readers sometimes call these figures beings rather than kings, especially when the enormous reign lengths are combined with later Mesopotamian traditions about divine assemblies and supernatural sages. That interpretation is intriguing, but the surviving king list itself does not plainly say that 8 disguised entities walk among humans. The clay is stranger in a quieter way. It gives 8 rulers impossible lifespans and places them inside a world where political authority descends from heaven. It leaves the reader to decide what kind of beings such rulers were imagined to be. There is also an unresolved scholarly question concerning how much the earliest portion preserves genuine cultural memory. Southern Mesopotamia experienced repeated flooding, shifting river courses, abandoned settlements, and major social transformations. Archaeological layers from several cities reveal destructive floods at different times, though they do not point toward one simple universal event. Ancient communities may have preserved memories of severe regional catastrophes and folded them into larger sacred traditions. Perhaps the rulers belong to the same process. distant political memories stretched until they inhabit the realm of myth. For a moment, the tablet seems less like a historical document and more like a doorway. Behind those carefully impressed signs lies a society trying to explain why kings rule, why cities rise, and why civilization appears fragile beneath forces larger than humanity. The 8 rulers stand at the threshold of that explanation. They do not speak directly. They do not reveal their faces. They are presented through names, cities, and impossible numbers. And that restraint creates its own peculiar unease. You can almost hear the faint scrape of the stylus again. A hand presses another sign into clay. Another reign is measured in thousands of years. Another city receives kingship. Nothing is hurried. Nothing is explained more than necessary. The ancient scribe seems entirely comfortable with a world in which heaven grants authority and rulers endure beyond any human lifetime. Perhaps that calm certainty is the most unsettling detail of all. The mystery does not begin with monsters, visitors, or secret disguises. It begins with bureaucracy. 8 names are entered into an ordered record, and the impossible is treated as perfectly ordinary. Kingship descends from heaven, and you're invited to consider what that sentence might have meant to people living among canals, reed marshes, temple platforms, and uncertain rivers. The phrase does not merely decorate a royal genealogy, it establishes a direction. Authority comes downward. Human society receives order from somewhere above itself, and that belief shapes how rulers, priests, temples, and cities understand their place in the world. In ancient Mesopotamia, political power is rarely presented as something purely human. A ruler may command soldiers, supervise labour, and build walls, yet legitimacy still requires a connection with the divine order that surrounds ordinary life. Your mind drifts toward Eridu beneath a pale southern sky. The ground feels warm beneath your feet, and the smell of wet reeds mixes with baked mud and standing water. Small boats move quietly through channels. Fish break the surface, then vanish. Somewhere behind mud brick walls, grain is measured, animals are counted, and offerings are prepared for a temple that has stood in one form or another for generations. Archaeological work at Eridu revealed a remarkable sequence of sacred buildings constructed upon earlier sacred buildings. The repeated rebuilding suggests that the location itself carried enduring religious importance, even as architecture changed around it. Eridu becomes associated especially with Enki, the deity linked with fresh water, wisdom, craft, and hidden knowledge. This connection matters because water is not merely scenery in southern Mesopotamia. Water is survival, danger, fertility, boundaries, and mystery. Beneath the earth, ancient people imagined a deep freshwater realm feeding wells and rivers. A god associated with that hidden source naturally becomes connected with intelligence and creative order. The city standing close to marshlands therefore becomes more than a settlement. It becomes a meeting point between human habitation and forces believed to sustain the world. Records confirm that rulers throughout Mesopotamian history repeatedly tied themselves to divine approval. Royal inscriptions describe temples restored for gods, cities protected under divine favour, and military success granted through supernatural support. This does not mean every ruler is treated as a god. The relationship varies by place and period, yet kingship itself remains sacred enough that its legitimacy must be explained through divine relationships. A throne is never just furniture. A crown is never merely decoration. Every symbol whispers that power belongs within a larger cosmic arrangement. For ancient listeners, the claim that kingship descended from heaven may have sounded less extraordinary than it sounds now. They live in a world where storms possess divine personality, stars carry signs, and rivers can reveal displeasure through catastrophe. Natural forces and divine intention are intertwined. You cannot easily separate politics from religion because the gods are believed to care about cities, temples, treaties, harvests, and royal conduct. A ruler who loses divine favour can lose more than reputation. He may lose the explanation that makes his authority meaningful. A curious detail appears in the way Mesopotamian cities compete for sacred prestige. Different communities preserve traditions that place their own temples, gods, or rulers near the centre of the cosmic story. This is hardly surprising. Human beings remain human beings. Even while discussing eternity, a city claiming divine importance gains prestige, pilgrims, political weight, and a stronger identity. Ancient theology therefore carries traces of local rivalry. One temple might insist that its deity established an essential institution. Another might preserve a different version. Sacred memory can be sincere and competitive at the same time. This tension becomes especially interesting when kingship moves from one city to another in written tradition. The transfer is presented with the unusual simplicity. One city holds kingship, then another receives it. The sequence creates the impression that political supremacy is transferable because the institution itself exists independently of any one dynasty. Human rulers come and go, but kingship remains almost like a sacred object passing between chosen places. The city is temporary. The institution is enduring. That idea turns political change into a cosmic event, rather than a mere struggle between ambitious men. Scholars continue to debate how literally such formulas should be interpreted. Some emphasize theological meaning, arguing that the language expresses a worldview in which political order reflects divine order. Others focus on scribal ideology, noting that later compilers may have arranged older traditions to support particular claims about legitimate succession. There is no need to force one explanation to destroy the other. A text can serve religion, politics, memory, and literature simultaneously. Ancient scribes are perfectly capable of preserving belief while also shaping power. You can picture a ruler entering a temple courtyard beneath fluttering standards. Sandals scrape against packed earth. Incense hangs in warm air. Priests move through controlled routines, and musicians produce low sounds that echo against plastered walls. The ruler approaches not merely as a private worshipper, but as someone whose authority depends upon the relationship being performed. Offerings are presented, sacred words are spoken. The political order is placed beneath divine attention. Every gesture reminds the audience that kingship requires recognition from powers greater than the king. This does not make the ruler powerless, quite the opposite. Divine association strengthens royal authority. If a king claims that his office belongs within the will of the gods, obedience can become more than political duty. It may feel like participation in cosmic stability. Roads, irrigation, warfare, temple construction, taxation, and law all become easier to frame as parts of a divinely approved order. The sacred language does not replace administration. It gives administration a larger meaning. One fringe interpretation takes the phrase about kingship descending from heaven as a literal memory of outsiders arriving from the sky. Such ideas appear frequently in modern alternative history, particularly when ancient texts mention heavenly descent, divine beings, or unusual lifespans. The difficulty is that Mesopotamian religious language routinely describes divine authority in vertical terms. Heaven lies above, gods descend, blessings descend, and celestial order reaches human society. Literal physical arrival is possible within mythic imagination, but it is not required by the wording. The language already makes sense within the religion that produced it. Still, the phrase retains its power because it creates distance between humanity and the source of authority. Kingship is not born in a village meeting. It does not emerge from farmers choosing a leader beneath a tree. It comes from somewhere humans cannot fully control. That distance gives the institution an almost alien quality. Even without modern speculation, the ruler stands on Earth, but the principle that authorizes him belongs elsewhere. Human society therefore becomes a recipient of order rather than its ultimate creator. The smell of damp clay returns as evening settles across the imagined city. Somewhere, a temple doorway closes with the dull sound of wood against mud brick. Workers leave storehouses, birds settle among reeds, the sky darkens slowly, and stars appear above a landscape where every bright point can carry significance. You begin to understand why heaven is not an empty abstraction here. It is visible every night. It arches above homes, canals, temples, kings, and graves. It seems both distant and constantly present. Perhaps that is why the earliest rulers feel so difficult to classify. They stand close to the moment when divine kingship first reaches Earth. Their authority belongs to a threshold where sacred time and human time have not separated cleanly. They rule cities, yet their reigns exceed ordinary life. They appear in lists, yet they resemble figures from myth. Their world looks administrative from one angle and supernatural from another. The ambiguity is not a flaw in the tradition. It may be the very thing the tradition preserves. You remain within that uncertainty as the river moves quietly through darkness. Somewhere beyond the walls, frogs call from shallow water, a faint wind brushes the reeds. The idea of kingship descending from heaven no longer sounds like a decorative phrase. It sounds like a statement about the architecture of existence itself. Power begins above. Order reaches downward. Humanity receives it, interprets it, and builds cities beneath its shadow. Whether that descent was imagined as divine presence, sacred authority, political ideology, or something stranger remains open, and the ancient clay refuses to settle the question. The sequence of rulers unfolds across 5 cities, and each name seems to pull you deeper into a world where geography and sacred memory become inseparable. Eridu stands first, but the line of kingship does not remain there. It moves onward through Bad Tibira, Laurag, Zimbir, and finally Shurapak. These places are not presented as random settlements. They form a deliberate chain of authority, each city holding kingship for a time before surrendering it to another centre. The movement itself feels almost ritualized, as though political power travels along an invisible route across the southern plain. At Eridu, the first 2 rulers are Alulim and Alalga. Their names stand at the threshold of the primeval age, attached to reigns that stretch far beyond ordinary human possibility. Alulim rules for 28,800 years. Alalga follows with 36,000 years. The numbers create an immediate sense of scale, but the sequence remains strangely calm. There is no surviving dramatic account of their coronations, wars, marriages, or deaths. They are reduced to name and city and duration, which gives them the stillness of figures carved into a sealed door. Kingship then passes to Bad Tibira, a city whose name is often linked with metalworking traditions in later interpretation. The landscape in your imagination changes subtly. You hear the dull rhythm of hammering, smell charcoal, and feel dry heat rising from workshops near mud-brick streets. Here 3 rulers appear: Enmenlu-Ena, Enmengal-Ana, and Dumuzid the Shepherd. Their reigns continue the impossible pattern, each measured in vast spans that make centuries look brief. Enmenlu-Ana is credited with 43,200 years of rule. Enmengal-Ana receives 28,800 years. Dumuzid the Shepherd is given 36,000 years. The repeated numerical structure is difficult to ignore. Scholars have long noticed that many of these reigns are built from carefully patterned values rather than casual estimates. The numbers fit Mesopotamian mathematical habits, particularly systems based on 60. This does not solve their meaning, but it reminds you that the enormous durations may have been designed rather than merely exaggerated. Dumuzid is especially intriguing because his name appears elsewhere in Mesopotamian tradition. He becomes associated with pastoral life, fertility, death, and seasonal return. In later literary material, he is not simply a king buried beneath ordinary genealogy. He occupies mythic space. That overlap between royal listing and divine narrative makes the sequence more complicated. One figure can belong to several cultural worlds at once. To modern categories, this feels messy. To ancient storytellers, it may have felt perfectly natural. A curious fringe claim sometimes suggests that these rulers represent separate non-human species or visiting groups, each stationed in a particular city. The idea draws energy from the vast reign lengths and unusual names, but the surviving texts do not identify them in such biological terms. What they do show is already strange enough. Several rulers occupy a period deliberately placed outside conventional history, and at least one later becomes deeply entangled with mythology. The ancient material does not need modern machinery to remain mysterious. From Bad Tibera, Kittu the kingship moves to Larag, where a ruler named Ensipadzid Anna appears. His reign lasts 28,800 years. Larag remains one of the more shadowed locations in the sequence, and its exact ancient setting has generated discussion among scholars. That uncertainty creates a different atmosphere. Some cities leave monumental ruins, tablets, temples, and unmistakable traces. Others survive mainly through names preserved in written traditions. Hovering between archaeology and literary geography, you feel the land growing quieter. Wind pushes dust across fields cut by irrigation channels. The sun lowers behind flat horizons, turning water bronze somewhere beyond sight. A settlement rises from mud brick walls, but little of it will endure. Mud brick is practical, abundant, and terribly vulnerable to time. Rain erodes it, floodwater dissolves it. New generations build directly over old foundations. Entire urban landscapes can flatten into mounds while their names survive on clay tablets stored far away. Zimba receives kingship next. The city is better known to later readers as Sippar, a place strongly associated with the sun god. Here Enmendur Anna rules for 21,000 years. His name becomes especially interesting because later Mesopotamian tradition connects a similarly named primeval figure with divine knowledge. In later accounts, this figure is taken into the presence of the gods and taught secret wisdom connected with divination and ritual knowledge. The resemblances encourage scholars to examine how older royal traditions may have interacted with later stories about sacred specialists. This is one of those places where interpretation remains open. Some historians see evidence of older mythic material being folded into king lists. Others caution that names and traditions can evolve independently, and apparent connections should not be treated too confidently. The debate matters because it touches the central problem of primeval kingship. Are these rulers' memories of ancient leaders transformed by storytelling, symbolic figures created for theological purposes, or literary combinations of several traditions? The tablets preserve the names, but not the explanation. Enmendur Anna also contributes to the modern fascination with the idea of watchers. Later accounts place him near heavenly instruction, secret knowledge, and divine teachers. Yet the distinction must remain clear. The older king list gives him a city and a reign. Later literature gives related figures additional sacred roles. When these traditions are blended carelessly, a new story can emerge that seems ancient even when parts of it come from different centuries. That process is fascinating in itself because it shows how myths continue to grow long after their earliest forms. The final city in the primeval sequence is Shuropak. Here Ubaratutu rules for 18,600 years. His reign is the shortest among the 8, though calling 18,600 years short feels faintly absurd. The ancient numbers have a way of bending ordinary language. Shuruppak is especially important because archaeological excavations there revealed substantial occupation and evidence of flooding during the early history of the city. The site therefore anchors part of this legendary landscape in very real mud, buildings, pottery, and destruction layers. Ubaratutu stands at the edge of catastrophe within the tradition. He is the 8th ruler, completing the sequence of 5 cities and 8 names. No elaborate description explains his personality. No surviving passage tells you what he feared during the night or what ceremonies surrounded his court. His importance comes from position. He is the final king of a world whose chronology belongs to a different order. The sequence gathers itself around him, then approaches a boundary that will divide primeval time from what comes later. The total reigns form an immense structure. 8 rulers govern through 5 cities for a combined span measured in hundreds of thousands of years. These figures are clearly not casual additions. Their arrangement gives the impression of a system, almost like a sacred chronology mapped onto geography. One city yields to another. One ruler replaces the previous ruler. The extraordinary durations shrink and vary, yet the pattern remains controlled. Records from ancient Mesopotamia confirm that scribes often organize the past into meaningful sequences, rather than simply preserving events without interpretation. Lists could establish legitimacy, connect dynasties, rank cities, and create a sense of continuous order. The primeval rulers fit comfortably within that intellectual habit. Their world is structured, counted, and named. Even the mythical past receives administration. You can almost trace the route with your fingers across a map of the alluvial plain, Eridu near ancient wetlands, Bad Tibira among southern settlements, uncertain Larag, Solar Zimbir, and Shuruppak near the waterways that sustain the land. Each city becomes a station in a journey through sacred time. The rulers themselves remain silent, but their arrangement speaks. Authority travels, cities rise into prominence, names endure longer than walls. Perhaps the most haunting aspect is how little explanation survives. 8 figures are enough to construct an entire vanished age, yet not enough to tell you what that age truly was. You are left with names impressed into clay, numbers too vast for ordinary life, and cities that once stood beneath the same stars visible tonight. The record preserves the shape of a system while withholding its meaning, and that silence allows the ancient world to remain just beyond reach. The reign lengths stretch so far beyond human experience that ordinary chronology begins to lose its familiar shape. A ruler governing for several decades feels plausible. A ruler governing for a century would already invite suspicion. Yet when the numbers climb into tens of thousands of years, the question changes completely. You're no longer asking whether a king lived unusually long. You're asking what kind of time the scribes believed they were recording. The ancient figures seem to belong to a cell where human generations become almost invisible, like footprints disappearing beneath desert wind. Mesopotamian scribes were not careless with numbers. Their mathematical traditions were sophisticated, systematic, and deeply connected with administration, astronomy, land measurement, and trade. Clay tablets preserve calculations involving fields, grain, labour, interest, geometry, and celestial observation. Scholars working at institutions such as Yale and Oxford have demonstrated how carefully ancient mathematical education was organised. This matters because enormous royal reigns cannot simply be dismissed as random fantasy produced by people who could not count. The same scribal culture capable of precise accounting also preserved lifespans that appeared deliberately impossible. You feel the texture of a counting tablet beneath your fingertips. Small marks divide quantities into groups, while a reed stylus leaves neat impressions in damp clay. Numbers are not abstract ornaments here. They regulate food rations, workers, livestock, and property. Yet Mesopotamian mathematics also carries symbolic habits that modern readers can easily overlook. The number 60 plays an especially important role. Larger values are often built through multiples and repeated factors, giving numerical sequences a patterned quality that would have been immediately recognizable to trained scribes. Several primeval reigns fit neatly into such patterns. Values repeat, divide, and relate into one another in ways that suggest calculation rather than memory of literal anniversaries. That observation has encouraged historians to ask whether the reigns functioned symbolically. Perhaps certain numbers represented completeness, cosmic order, or different categories of sacred time. Perhaps scribes inherited older numerical traditions whose original meanings were already fading. Perhaps they adjusted reigns to create a grand total that carried mathematical significance. The surviving evidence allows possibilities, but not certainty. One mainstream interpretation is that the earliest reigns belong to mythological chronology rather than biological history. Ancient cultures often placed extraordinary lifespans in the distant past. The farther one travels from ordinary time, the larger people become, the longer ancestors live, and the closer rulers stand to gods. Such patterns appear in several civilizations, though their specific meanings differ. Within Mesopotamia, enormous reigns may signal that the primeval age operates under different conditions from later human history. Time itself seems denser, larger, and less constrained. This interpretation does not make the numbers meaningless. Mythological numbers can be carefully chosen. A temple measurement can carry symbolic weight while remaining a real measurement. A royal title can be political and religious simultaneously. In the same way, an impossible reign can communicate sacred scale without functioning as literal biography. The challenge is that ancient scribes rarely pause to explain their symbolism to readers living thousands of years later. They assume familiarity with conventions that have vanished. A quirky modern theory proposes that the numbers contain encoded astronomical cycles. Supporters sometimes compare the reigns with planetary periods, precession, or other long celestial measurements. The attraction is easy to understand because Mesopotamian scholars eventually became exceptional observers of the night sky. Yet the evidence for matching the earliest king list directly to precise astronomical cycles remains speculative. Similar numbers can often be made to resemble multiple systems once enough mathematical adjustments are allowed. Patterns are seductive, particularly when the original explanation is missing. Still so, the association between kingship and the heavens deserves careful attention. Mesopotamian rulers regularly presented themselves beneath celestial signs, while priests watched stars and planets for omens. The sky was treated as a field of divine communication. Eclipses, unusual planetary movements, and atmospheric events could carry political meaning. A ruler's fate might be interpreted through observations made far above his palace roof. Time, kingship, and heaven were therefore already connected within the culture, even if the extraordinary reigns cannot be reduced to astronomical codes. For a moment, it feels as though you are standing on a temple roof late at night. The heat of the day has faded from the bricks. A faint breeze moves across the city, carrying smoke and the smell of river mud. Above you, the stars appear sharper than they do over most modern cities. There are no electric lights to soften them. The sky becomes an enormous black surface marked by predictable movements. Generations of observers notice that certain lights wander, others return seasonally, and some patterns measure time more reliably than human memory. Imagine how a civilization shaped by such observation might conceive of deep time. Human life is brief, but the sky repeats. Rivers shift, cities collapse, dynasties fail, yet celestial cycles continue. A reign lasting tens of thousands of years might therefore place a ruler closer to cosmic duration than ordinary mortality. The king becomes less like an individual man and more like a marker within sacred chronology. His name labels an age. Scholars continue to debate how the large numbers developed. Some emphasize literary construction. Others examine whether scribe multiplied shorter traditions through numerical systems. A few researchers have explored whether copying practices altered values over centuries. Clay tablets can preserve information remarkably well, but scribal transmission is still human. Signs can be misunderstood, conventions can shift, and older numbers can acquire new interpretations. The question is not merely what the earliest values were, but what later copyists believed they meant. There is another possibility that feels quieter. Perhaps enormous reigns serve political purposes. By extending kingship into an unimaginably distant past, scribes make the institution itself seem ancient beyond challenge. A particular ruler may die, but kingship appears almost eternal. If authority has existed since a sacred age, then the throne gains legitimacy through age alone. Political systems often benefit from presenting themselves as older than they truly are. Ancient Mesopotamia was certainly capable of such ideological sophistication. The numbers also create hierarchy. Ordinary people live short lives. Even successful rulers eventually age, weaken, and disappear. But a primeval king who reigns for tens of thousands of years stands beyond ordinary comparison. His duration signals distance from common humanity. Whether that distance is symbolic, mythological, or theological, it places the earliest rulers in a category apart. They become almost architectural figures, supporting the structure of the remembered past. This is where modern imagination often moves quickly toward non-human explanations. If someone rules for 30,000 years, perhaps he is not human. The logic feels tempting. Yet ancient literature frequently uses impossible numbers without requiring literal biology. Epic traditions in large armies, lifespans, distances, and treasures because scale itself communicates significance. The cautious position is not to remove mystery, but to locate it correctly. The question is not whether these rulers secretly possessed modern forms of immortality. The deeper question is why ancient scribes chose numbers that deliberately exceeded human possibility. You hear the soft scrape of a stylus again, but now every numerical sign feels heavier. A value is pressed into clay with enough precision that another scribe can copy it centuries later. The number survives while its explanation disappears. That is the peculiar survival of ancient mathematics. We can often read the quantity more easily than the meaning behind it. Perhaps the reigns were sacred arithmetic. Perhaps they were inherited myth. Perhaps they transformed memories of rulers into cosmic ages. It is possible that several explanations overlap. The people preserving these traditions may not have distinguished between symbolic mathematics and sacred history as sharply as modern scholars do. For them, a carefully calculated number could reveal truth without being literal in the modern sense. The longer you remain with these impossible reigns, the less they resemble failed history. They begin to resemble a deliberate language of distance. Tens of thousands of years separate the primeval rulers from ordinary kings, not merely in chronology, but in category. Their ages tell you that you have entered a world where human measurements still exist, yet human limits no longer apply. The clay counts patiently, while the meaning remains suspended somewhere between mathematics, mythology, and the night sky. The distinction between king and god becomes difficult to hold once you enter the world preserved in Mesopotamian memory. Some rulers remain unmistakably human. Others acquire divine qualities, receive worship, or appear beside deities in ways that complicate every modern category. A name can begin in political history and later drift into sacred legend. A god can carry the title of king. A king can claim divine ancestry. The boundaries are not absent. But they are flexible enough to make the earliest rulers especially difficult to classify with confidence. You feel the cool surface of a temple threshold beneath your hand. Beyond it, incense rises through a dim interior where statues watch from shadowed niches. Gold, shell, stone, and polished wood catch small points of lamplight. Priests move carefully through prescribed gestures. Somewhere outside, officials count barley and record deliveries on clay. Sacred ritual and practical administration exist side by side. In such a setting, religion does not float above daily life. It touches taxation, warfare, labour, inheritance, irrigation, and the right to rule. Mesopotamian rulers often presented themselves as servants chosen by the gods. Inscriptions describe kings restoring temples because a deity commanded them, defeating enemies through divine favour, or governing according to sacred justice. These claims were political, but they were also sincere expressions of a worldview in which divine and human affairs constantly overlapped. A ruler who built a temple did more than commission architecture. He repaired the relationship between city and god, at least according to the language of royal ideology. Yet some kings moved even closer to divine status. The ruler Naram-Sin of Akkad, who lived many centuries after the earliest legendary age, famously adopted divine markers and royal imagery and inscription. He could be represented wearing a horned crown, a visual sign strongly associated with divinity. Historians have studied this development as evidence that Mesopotamian kingship could expand beyond ordinary human status under particular political conditions. It does not mean every king became a god, but it proves that the category was negotiable. That flexibility matters because the earliest rulers stand in a zone where documentation becomes thinner and mythic tradition becomes stronger. If later historical rulers could be elevated toward divinity, then a primeval ruler remembered across many generations could drift even further from ordinary humanity. Memory does strange things with powerful figures. Victories grow larger, wisdom becomes supernatural, longevity expands. A ruler who once solved practical problems can become the founder of sacred customs. A distant ancestor may eventually look less like a person and more like a force. One unusual example appears in the way heroic figures can cross between genres. A ruler might appear in a list, a hymn, a myth, and an epic without playing exactly the same role in each. The texts do not necessarily contradict one another because they serve different purposes. A list creates succession. A hymn creates devotion, an epic creates memory through story. Modern readers often ask which version is the real one. Ancient scribes may have been more comfortable allowing several versions to coexist. Researchers at major universities have long emphasized that Mesopotamian royal ideology cannot be separated neatly from temple culture. Archaeological records show that temples controlled land, employed workers, stored goods, and participated in economic life. Religious institutions were therefore not merely symbolic centres, they were active parts of urban organisation. When a ruler associated himself with a major deity, he was linking his authority with both cosmic legitimacy and powerful earthly institutions. This makes the sacred language of kingship practical as well as spiritual. A ruler protected temples because temples mattered politically. Priests supported royal authority because kings mattered institutionally. Communities invested in both because cities depended on stable systems of grain, water, labour, and ritual. Nobody involved needed to be secretly cynical for these interests to overlap. Human societies often combine belief and advantage without feeling any contradiction. A quirky interpretation sometimes imagines that ancient rulers called themselves divine because they possessed abilities misunderstood by ordinary people, advanced technology, unusual knowledge, or physical difference is proposed as the hidden explanation. The problem is not that ancient people lack curiosity about extraordinary beings. They certainly imagined gods, monsters, demons, and sages. The problem is that political deification already has a clear cultural function. A king does not need hidden machinery to explain why subjects might represent him with divine season via symbols. Still, divine representation can change how later generations remember a ruler. Imagine seeing an ancient relief of king towering above soldiers, wearing symbols normally reserved for gods. If the political context disappears, the image becomes ambiguous. Is he a human pretending to be divine, a sacred ruler, or a god in human shape? Every missing explanation creates room for reinterpretation. Thousands of years later, that room becomes enormous. Scholars remain divided over how much historical memory survives within the earliest legendary traditions. Some argue that names may preserve echoes of genuine rulers or local dynasties later transformed by scribal culture. Others emphasize literary construction, suggesting that primeval kings of Woolworld function primarily as theological and political symbols. The uncertainty is important because ancient lists often mix clearly historical figures with characters who belong more comfortably to legend. The transition is gradual rather than clean. You can sense why this creates discomfort for modern chronology. Historians prefer evidence that can be compared across inscriptions, buildings, burials, and datable layers. A ruler becomes more secure historically when several independent traces point toward the same person. Primeval kings rarely offer such confirmation. Their existence rests more heavily upon later textual tradition. That does not make them meaningless, but it changes the question. Instead of asking whether every reign happened exactly as recorded, you ask what communities believed about the origin of power. The answer seems to involve sacred memory. A society preserves certain rulers because they explain something larger than themselves. They may explain why a city is holy, why a ritual exists, why a dynasty deserves respect, or why kingship should be obeyed. Memory becomes architecture. Names are fitted into a structure that supports the present. A ruler remembered as close to the gods can therefore serve as a bridge between worlds. He belongs to humanity because he governs cities. He belongs to sacred tradition because his authority reaches beyond ordinary limits. He can be presented as ancestral, heroic, blessed, or divine depending on the needs of the text. Each version adds another layer without completely erasing the others. The scent of wax smoke lingers as you picture generations of scribes copying names they may no longer fully understand. Some receive formal explanations from teachers. Others inherit conventions whose original meanings have faded. Title may once have carried a precise theological distinction, then survive as a respected formula. This happens in many cultures. Words outlive the systems that created them, and later readers give them new meaning. That possibility is especially relevant when dealing with figures whose names stand near the beginning of civilization itself. The farther memory reaches, the more it gathers symbolism. Historical rulers become ancestors. Ancestors become culture heroes. Culture heroes may become divine. The process is rarely visible in a single moment. It happens slowly, through copying, ritual, storytelling, and political need. Perhaps some primeval kings were once remembered as unusually powerful humans. Perhaps others were always mythic. Perhaps the list combines figures that never belonged to one original tradition. It is possible that sacred memory stitched them together, because later scribes wanted a continuous line stretching from divine order into human history. Such continuity would make kingship appear not accidental, but inevitable. You are left with figures who refuse a single identity. They stand between throne and temple, between memory and myth, between mortality and divine symbolism. Calling them simply human may flatten the tradition. Calling them gods may go too far. The ancient record preserves something more ambiguous and perhaps more revealing. It shows a culture in which power could move upward toward the sacred, while the sacred could descend into politics, until the distance between ruler and deity became difficult to measure. The divine assembly enters the story quietly, not as a single throne in the sky, but as a gathering of powers whose decisions shape the lives of cities and rulers. In Mesopotamian thought, the gods do not always act alone, they meet, deliberate, assign destinies, distribute authority, and sometimes disagree. You can imagine a celestial council whose members possess different responsibilities, personalities, and spheres of influence. Their world resembles a court, yet it operates on a scale far beyond any earthly palace. The idea of a divine council appears repeatedly across Mesopotamian literature. Major gods can be portrayed discussing kingship, warfare, creation, or punishment. Their decisions explain why events unfold in the human world, even when those events seem unpredictable from below. A drought, a victory, a failed harvest, or the fall of a city can therefore become more than circumstance. It may be interpreted as evidence that decisions have already been made, somewhere beyond ordinary sight. Your ears catch the imagined murmur of a temple courtyard at dusk. Sandals scrape over packed earth, while attendants carry offerings through heavy doors. The scent of roasted grain mixes with incense and warm stone. Above the courtyard, the sky darkens into violet. Priests speak words learned through long training, and every gesture assumes that unseen beings are listening. The ritual does not summon a vague spiritual presence. It addresses specific divine powers with names, responsibilities, and established relationships. Among those powers, several great deities stand in the center of Mesopotamian cosmic order. Anu is associated with the highest heaven and divine authority. Enlil carries immense power connected with command, wind, and kingship. Enki is linked with wisdom, fresh water, craft, and cunning intelligence. Other gods govern the sun, the moon, fertility and storms, writing, justice, and war. The pantheon is extensive, and its internal structure changes across cities and centuries. Yet the principle remains familiar. Human life unfolds beneath a network of divine agencies. Records confirm that major temples functioned as houses of gods, not merely places where people gathered for communal worship. A divine statue could receive food, clothing, music, and ceremonial attention. Temple staff maintained the deity's household through carefully organized routines. This arrangement made divine presence feel socially embedded. The gods did not exist only in distant heaven. They possessed residences, estates, servants, festivals, and relationships with rulers. Sacred administration and civic administration often touched the same ledgers. That structure also shaped political imagination. If earthly rulers depended upon divine approval, then the gods stood above them within an invisible hierarchy. A king could be powerful without being autonomous. He might claim that a deity chose him, commanded a campaign, or granted victory. Defeat could be explained as abandonment or anger from the same divine world. The ruler appears strong before his subjects, yet he remains accountable to forces he cannot command. This creates an atmosphere of constant observation. Divine eyes are not necessarily watching every private movement in the modern sense, but human actions unfold within a moral and ritual order believed to be visible to the gods. Oaths are taken before divine witnesses. Treaties invoke supernatural punishment for betrayal. Crimes can offend both community and its deity. Even hidden wrongdoing may carry consequences, because concealment from other people does not guarantee concealment from higher powers. One quirky tradition illustrates this fear with remarkable clarity. Mesopotamian omen literature treated unusual events as messages embedded in the world, the movement of animals, patterns in hook, shapes inside sacrificial organs, dreams, eclipses, and strange births could all be interpreted. The universe becomes readable because divine intention might leave traces everywhere. To modernize, the system can feel bewildering to trained specialists. It was an organized discipline requiring memory, classification, and generations of accumulated precedent. Scholars continue to debate how ordinary people understood these complex systems compared with professional priests and scribes. Elite texts preserve sophisticated theology, but daily religion may have been more immediate and practical. A farmer worried about rain, a parent worried about illness, and a merchant worried about safe travel might approach the gods differently from a court scholar interpreting celestial omens. The divine world was shared, but access to specialized knowledge was unequal. This difference becomes important when considering the idea of hidden powers. A trained ritual specialist might claim knowledge unavailable to the average person. He understands which god governs a particular danger, which offering is appropriate, and which sign indicates trouble. Knowledge itself becomes a kind of threshold. Those who can interpret the unseen seem closer to the forces shaping human fates. You can picture a palace official waiting nervously while a diviner examines an omen. The room is warm, and oil lamps make the walls appear to breathe. Outside, soldiers prepare for movement, but nobody knows whether the campaign will proceed. The ruler may command Vadsanza men, yet a ritual interpretation can influence when he marches. Human power pauses before divine uncertainty. This does not mean Mesopotamian politics were controlled entirely by superstition. Kings calculated supplies, alliances, geography, labour, and military strength with considerable realism. Yet rational planning existed besides sacred interpretation. One did not necessarily cancel the other. A ruler could count grain carefully and still believe the gods determined ultimate success. Modern categories again become less useful than we might prefer. Fringe interpretations sometimes describe the divine assembly as a council of advanced beings physically supervising early humanity. Ancient references to gods assigning tasks, deciding fates, and descending to cities are taken as records of literal administrators. The appeal is obvious because the language can sound organizational, yet the surviving texts frame these beings within religion, ritual, and mythology rather than technological reporting. The council behaves like a divine court because ancient people understood cosmic order through familiar social structures. Still, the administrative quality of the divine world deserves attention. The gods have ranks, responsibilities, messengers, households, and territories. They can issue commands and distribute privileges. This resembles human government, but the direction of influence may run both ways. People model the heavens using earthly institutions, while earthly institutions gain legitimacy by claiming heavenly counterparts. The mirror becomes difficult to separate from the thing it reflects. Perhaps this is why divine supervision feels so persistent in the literature. Humanity is never entirely alone. Above every city stands a larger order, sometimes protective and sometimes dangerous. A ruler cannot simply govern, he governs under divine authority. A priest cannot simply perform ritual, he mediates between visible and invisible communities. Even a common household may maintain small acts of devotion because misfortune can be interpreted as evidence that unseen relationships have been disturbed. The hidden power in this system is not secrecy for its own sake. It is distance. The gods know more than humans, live beyond ordinary limits, and influence events from a realm that cannot be entered casually. Their intentions must be interpreted through ritual, omen, dream and sacred text, human beings receive fragments rather than complete explanations. You remain beneath that vast arrangement for a while, listening to the imagined city grow quiet. A dog barks beyond a wall, water moves through a canal, somewhere. A priest closes a temple door while stars appear overhead. The divine council cannot be seen, yet the entire society behaves as though its decisions matter. Whether understood as theology, political symbolism, or an ancient attempt to explain uncertainty, the result is the same. Humanity lives within a world where power is always present beyond the visible edge. Humanity enters the ancient story not as the centre of creation, but as a solution to a problem. The idea is unsettling because it turns ordinary assumptions upside down. In one Mesopotamian tradition, the gods themselves are burdened with exhausting labour. They dig canals, maintain the land, and perform the heavy work required to sustain the ordered world. Eventually, the strain becomes unbearable. Their complaint rises into open unrest, and the divine community must decide what to do with labour that no one wishes to continue. You can almost hear the sound of digging in the darkness. Wooden tools strike damp earth while water gathers in narrow channels. The soil clings to hands and ankles. Backs ache beneath the weight of baskets filled with mud. It is not the radiant heaven imagined in later religious art. It is labour. The gods are described through a strangely familiar problem, one that every agricultural society understands. Someone must move the earth, someone must carry the load. The tradition commonly known as the Atrahasis story preserves this remarkable picture. Scholars at major universities have examined its surviving tablets as part of the broader literature of ancient Mesopotamia. The text belongs to a long tradition of creation and flood stories in which divine beings, human beings, work, population, and catastrophe become closely connected. Its importance lies not only in its age, but in the way it explains why humans exist at all. Humanity appears because the existing order requires workers. This is very different from the comforting idea that humans are created simply because the universe needs someone to admire it. The purpose is practical. Labour must be transferred. The gods who perform the hardest tasks rebel against their condition, and a new being is devised to assume the burden. Human life therefore begins under the sign of service. Fields must be tended, canals maintained, temples supplied, and offerings prepared. Civilization is not a reward, it is an assignment. The creation itself carries another disturbing detail. In the story, a divine element is mixed with earthly material so that humanity can be formed. The exact theological meaning has been debated for generations, but the basic idea is powerful. Humans are made from matter associated with the ground while also receiving something connected with the divine realm. You are neither fully celestial nor merely clay. You occupy the uncomfortable middle space. This mixture explains much about Mesopotamian attitudes toward human existence. People are capable of intelligence, ritual, craft, and social order. Yet they remain mortal and dependent. They can communicate with gods through offerings and prayer, but they cannot become fully equal to them. They build temples reaching toward heaven, while knowing their bodies will eventually return to earth. The human condition is therefore defined by closeness and distance at the same time. A mainstream historical reading sees these creation stories as reflections of the societies that preserved them. Ancient Mesopotamian cities depended upon organized labor on an enormous scale. Canals required constant maintenance. Fields needed irrigation. Temple estates employed large numbers of workers. Kings demanded construction, military service, and agricultural production. In such a world, explaining human existence through labour would have felt immediately understandable. The cosmos itself resembles a vast estate, complete with hierarchy, duties, and supervisors. You feel the rough edge of a basket pressing against your shoulder. Heat rises from the ground, and the air smells of silt and sweat. Somewhere nearby, an overseer calls instructions while workers repair an embankment before the river rises. The task is repetitive, but failure would be catastrophic. If the canal wall breaks, crops disappear. If the channel silts up, fields dry. Civilization depends on work that is rarely glamorous and almost never finished. This practical reality gives the creation myth its weight. The story does not need to invent an abstract philosophy of human suffering. Everyone already understands physical exhaustion. The gods experience it first, then humanity inherits it. The transfer of labour becomes a cosmic explanation for why life feels difficult. You work because that is what humans were made to do. It is not particularly flattering. But ancient myths are often less interested in flattering humanity than modern readers expect. A curious fringe interpretation takes the story much more literally. According to this view, humanity was engineered by advanced non-human beings to perform labour on their behalf. Supporters point toward the mixing of divine and earthly substance, the assignment of work, and the organised structure of the divine community. The narrative can sound surprisingly technical when stripped of its religious setting, yet the surviving text uses mythological language rather than scientific description, and nothing requires a modern biological experiment to explain its meaning. Still, the imagery remains difficult to forget. Humanity is created with a purpose defined by beings who exist before it. That alone changes the emotional landscape. You're not watching humans invent gods to explain the weather. You're entering a story in which divine society already exists, already has problems, and then produces humanity as part of a solution. Humans arrive late. The world is already occupied. Scholars continue to debate how these traditions developed and how closely they reflect older Sumerian ideas. The surviving versions come from different periods and languages, and scribes adapted stories as political and religious centres changed. Some elements may preserve very ancient themes. Others may reflect later theological refinement. The text therefore cannot be treated as a single frozen account transmitted without change. They are living traditions shaped by centuries of copying and reinterpretation. Population becomes another problem within the story. Once humans multiply, their activity creates disturbance, noise rises from the earth, and the gods become increasingly troubled by it. This detail can feel almost humorous at first, as though divine beings have discovered the ancient equivalent of noisy neighbours. Yet the humour fades quickly. Human abundance creates pressure upon the relationship between creators and created. The very beings designed to solve one problem begin producing another. Attempts are made to reduce humanity through hardship, famine, disease, and environmental stress enter the narrative as tools of control. The pattern suggests that human existence is tolerated within limits, rather than guaranteed unconditionally. Civilization thrives only while the balance remains acceptable to the divine order. Too many people, too much disruption, and the arrangement begins to fail. This does not necessarily mean the gods are portrayed as simple villains. Mesopotamian deities can be protective, generous, unpredictable, severe, or deeply involved in human welfare. Different gods may disagree about how humanity should be treated. Some offer help when others demand punishment. The divine world contains competing interests, which makes its relationship with humanity more complex than a single command from above. Perhaps that complexity is what gives these stories their enduring unease. Human beings serve the gods, yet gods also depend upon human offerings and temples. People are subordinate, but they are not irrelevant. The relationship becomes almost reciprocal. Humans maintain sacred households, while the gods provide order, fertility, protection, and legitimacy. Each side participates in a system that appears unequal but interconnected. You begin to sense why later readers have imagined supervision within these myths. A created workforce naturally implies oversight. A population assigned to labour naturally suggests management. Yet the ancient evidence does not describe hidden observers disguised among ordinary people. The supervision is theological, social, and cosmic. Humanity exists beneath expectations set by divine powers whose presence is known through ritual and tradition. The deeper mystery lies in purpose. If humans were created to bear a burden, then work becomes more than survival. It becomes part of identity. Every canal cut through the plain, and every brick lifted, every offering prepared, and every field harvested can be understood as continuation of that original assignment. Civilization itself becomes evidence that the labour is never ended. The night air cools over the imagined plain, and tired workers leave the fields as darkness settles across the canals. Their footsteps fade along narrow paths between mud brick walls. Somewhere, food is being prepared. Somewhere, a child sleeps beside a reed mat. Above them, the gods remain unseen, while the human world continues performing the tasks that keep cities alive. Perhaps the old story survives because its central question never disappears. Were human beings created for freedom, for worship, for labour, or for some combination no one fully understands? The clay offers a purpose, but not a comfort. The sensation of being observed in ancient Mesopotamia does not depend upon hidden eyes behind a curtain. It grows from a much larger idea. Human life unfolds beneath powers believed to understand more, remember more, and see farther than ordinary people can. A private action might remain unknown to a neighbour, yet still matter within the divine order. This creates a quiet pressure around daily existence. You live in a world where actions can carry consequences beyond the moment in which they happen. At sunrise, a merchant opens the wooden door of his storeroom and checks sealed jars of grain. His fingers brush the rough clay of a tablet recording a debt. Somewhere nearby, a family prepares an offering before beginning the day's work. Nobody sees anything supernatural. There is only dust, sunlight, animals, smoke, and the familiar noise of a waking city. Yet beneath those ordinary movements sits the belief that contracts, promises, and moral conduct exist within a sacred framework. Oaths make this especially clear. Agreements could be sworn in the names of gods, turning a human promise into something more dangerous than ordinary speech. To break such an oath was not merely to deceive another person, it risked provoking divine punishment. The gods named in the agreement became witnesses whose presence did not depend upon human surveillance. A dishonest person might escape a judge or creditor, but he could not easily claim that the sacred witnesses had failed to notice. This idea appears throughout legal and diplomatic traditions. Treaties invoke divine powers to guarantee loyalty, while curses describe consequences for betrayal. Kings use similar language when establishing agreements between states. The structure reveals something important about ancient political psychology. Human enforcement has limits. A distant ruler cannot watch every official, soldier, or ally. Divine witnesses solve that problem symbolically. They extend authority into places where ordinary supervision cannot reach. You can hear the soft crackle of an oil lamp inside a room where two men negotiate late into the evening. A tablet lies between them, still damp enough to receive signs. Witnesses sit nearby, listening carefully. Names are recorded, terms are repeated. Then divine powers are invoked, and the atmosphere changes. The agreement is no longer a private arrangement between two households. It has entered a larger moral landscape. Fate operates in a similar way. Mesopotamian literature often treats destiny as something that can be assigned, declared, altered, or confirmed by gods. Human beings make decisions, but those decisions unfold inside limits that may already have been set elsewhere. This does not remove human responsibility. Rather, it places human choice inside a universe where unseen decisions also matter. A ruler can prepare carefully for war and still wonder whether victory has already been granted to someone else. Divination develops within this uncertainty. Specialists study signs because divine intention is believed to leave patterns within the world. A strange dream, an unusual animal, the movement of a planet, or the condition of a sacrificial organ might carry information. The goal is not simple fortune-telling in the modern popular sense. It is closer to reading evidence left by powers whose plans cannot be questioned directly. The future may be hidden, but perhaps it is not completely silent. Research into Mesopotamian divination has shown how systematic these traditions became. Scholars have reconstructed enormous collections of omens arranged by category and precedent. The sheer scale of the material demonstrates that ancient experts treated interpretation as a disciplined field. They collected observations, remembered outcomes, and trained specialists to recognize patterns. Their world was filled with signs because their theology assumed that higher knowledge could sometimes leak into human awareness. A quirky belief within the system involves dreams sent by gods. Certain dreams could be interpreted as warnings, instructions, or promises. A ruler might wake from sleep convinced that a divine figure had delivered a message. Modern readers may approach such reports psychologically, politically, or symbolically, but the ancient context gives dreams unusual authority. Sleep temporarily weakens the boundary between ordinary perception and hidden knowledge. In darkness, a person might receive what daylight refuses to reveal. This naturally encourages later imagination. If gods can watch humans, send dreams, assign fates, witness oaths, and communicate through signs, then it becomes tempting to describe them as observers. Yet the word can be misleading. Ancient texts do not require a secret surveillance system resembling modern ideas of monitoring. The divine world is simply assumed to possess access to information unavailable to ordinary humans. Observation is part of power. Some modern fringe interpretations go further. They suggest that ancient descriptions of divine oversight preserve memories of beings who physically monitored early societies. Temples become control centers, priests become intermediaries, and omens become misunderstood signals. Such theories often combine separate texts into one continuous narrative. The difficulty is that Mesopotamian literature already provides a coherent religious explanation for divine knowledge. A god does not need hidden instruments to know what humans cannot. Still, the emotional effect remains striking. To live beneath divine attention is to experience privacy differently. A person may hide an action from family, neighbours, or officials, but sacred order remains theoretically present. This does not mean every Mesopotamian lived in constant fear. Religion also offered protection, healing, fertility, guidance, and reassurance. The same gods who punish wrongdoing can guard a household, bless a child, or guide a traveller home. Scholars debate how deeply elite theological ideas shaped everyday behaviour. Most surviving texts were written by trained specialists, officials, or scribes, while ordinary farmers and labourers left far fewer written reflections. Archaeology provides household shrines, figurines, amulets, and ritual objects that suggest personal religious practices were widespread. Yet the exact thoughts of a common worker remain difficult to recover. Elite texts tell us what institutions taught, not always what every individual privately believed. You can imagine a woman touching a small protective object before leaving home. The gesture lasts only a moment. Her concerns are immediate, perhaps illness, childbirth, travel, or family safety. She does not need a grand theory of cosmic surveillance. She needs reassurance that unseen danger can be met by unseen protection. In this way, The idea of divine presence becomes intimate rather than abstract. That intimacy may help explain why protective beings appear so often in Mesopotamian material culture. Homes and temples could be defended symbolically by figures representing supernatural guardians. Their purpose was not necessarily to watch humans, but to watch over spaces. The distinction matters. Observation can be protective as easily as threatening. A guardian at a doorway sees danger approaching before the household does. The concept of watching therefore divides into several meanings. God's witness promises. Diviners search for signs. Protective beings guard boundaries. Fate is shaped by powers beyond human knowledge. Priests interpret messages that others cannot read. None of these elements alone creates a story of hidden beings disguised among humanity. Together, however, they reduce a culture in which unseen attention feels perfectly natural. Perhaps this is why the modern idea of watchers finds such fertile ground here. The ancient world already contains eyes beyond the visible. It already imagines knowledge moving downward through dreams, omens, rituals, and decrees. It already treats human behavior as something noticed by higher powers. The modern imagination only needs to change the mechanism. The city grows quieter under a moonlit sky, and the last voices fade from the courtyards. Doors close, lamps dim. A dog circles twice before settling near a threshold. Somewhere, a tablet records an oath whose witnesses cannot be seen. Somewhere else, a sleeper waits unknowingly for a dream. The ancient sense of being observed does not come from shadows moving through an alley. It comes from the conviction that the world itself is attentive, and that human life unfolds inside a field of meaning larger than anyone can fully perceive. The number 7 enters the ancient record with a different kind of mystery. Not kings this time, but sages. They appear in traditions connected with wisdom, ritual protection, and the deep past, and their presence complicates any neat attempt to identify exactly 8 beings watching humanity. The ancient material refuses simplicity. One tradition gives 8 primeval rulers, another speaks of 7 extraordinary sages. The temptation to fuse them is strong, yet the differences may be more revealing than the resemblance. Your mind drifts into a temple workshop where carved figures stand beneath filtered light. Some possess human features, while others seem partly covered by fish skins. Their forms are strange without being chaotic. They belong to a symbolic world understood by people who knew how such images should be read. To you, they can look almost theatrical. To an ancient priest, every detail may have carried ritual meaning. These sages are often associated with profound knowledge. They are linked with the earliest rulers, with the transmission of civilization, and with skills that separate an ordered city from a wilderness. Later Mesopotamian traditions describe them as wise figures who advise kings and preserve sacred knowledge. They do not simply govern, they instruct. Their importance lies in what they know, and in their proximity to a world believed to exist near the beginning of human order. The mainstream historical view treats these sages as mythological or semi-divine culture figures whose traditions developed over long periods. Scholars working with Mesopotamian ritual texts have shown that their names and functions vary depending on the sort. Some are associated with ancient kings, others appear in protective rituals. The category is therefore not perfectly fixed. What remains consistent is their relationship with wisdom, sacred authority, and the defense of ordered space. That connection with kings is especially important. A ruler who stands beside a supernatural advisor appears less isolated. He governs within a structure of knowledge larger than himself. The sage can function as teacher, ritual specialist, guardian, or intermediary. If kingship represents authority, the sage represents understanding. Power without wisdom is unstable. Wisdom without power remains hidden. together, they create a pattern that later scribes seem to find deeply meaningful. A curious detail emerges from tradition surrounding the first and most famous of these sages. He is sometimes described as coming from the waters, bringing knowledge useful to human civilization. Modern readers quickly notice the unusual imagery. A being connected with the sea arrives and teaches humanity. That sounds almost designed to provoke speculation. Yet water already carries profound associations with wisdom, creation, and hidden depth in Mesopotamian religion, so the symbolism fits comfortably within the ancient worldview. The image of the fish-covered sage creates even more fascination. Surviving artistic representations show human-like figures wearing what appears to be a fish skin over the head and body. The human face can remain visible beneath the fish head, while the fish body extends downward like a ritual garment. This visual detail has encouraged modern claims that the figures are wearing disguises. The ancient evidence suggests something more ritual and symbolic, though the exact meaning remains debated. You can imagine the sensation of such a costume. The material rests heavily across the shoulders. The carved fish head rises above the human face. Scales run down the back. In torchlight, the outline might look neither fully human nor fully animal. It creates deliberate ambiguity. The wearer seems to inhabit two identities at once. Whether real priests ever dressed exactly like the figures is another question. Artistic imagery does not automatically document ordinary costume. The representations may portray supernatural beings rather than human performers. They may symbolize protective qualities, association with water, or ancient wisdom. Scholars continue to debate how directly ritual art reflects physical ceremonies. The uncertainty is important because a carved image can represent theology without recording literal appearance. This is where modern interpretations often begin to separate from the ancient context. Some fringe writers identify the fish-covered sages as beings using animal forms to hide their true bodies. Others propose protective suits, breathing equipment, or ceremonial disguises concealing non-human visitors. Such interpretations depend heavily on modern visual associations. A fish skin becomes a suit because a modern viewer expects equipment. An ancient viewer may have understood something entirely different. The distinction does not make the image less strange. In fact, removing modern machinery allows the symbolism to become stranger in a quieter way. Why represent wisdom through a body that combines human and fish elements? Why place such beings near kings and sacred spaces? Why preserve their identities across centuries of ritual tradition? The answers likely belong to religious symbolism, but symbolism can carry ideas just as powerful as literal description. 7 sages also create a numerical problem for theories focused on 8 watchers. The numbers do not match. This matters because modern retellings sometimes smooth over such inconsistencies by combining different traditions into one system. 7 sages become 8 rulers, or 8 rulers become 8 divine beings, while another group of gods is quietly added to fill gaps. The resulting story sounds coherent because the ancient differences have been removed. Ancient sources are rarely so tidy. Different cities preserve different traditions. Names change as numbers vary, functions overlap. Later scribes reinterpret older material. A figure who appears as a culture hero in one text may become a protective spirit in another. This complexity is not evidence of confusion. It is evidence of a tradition living for centuries. Researchers from major universities have emphasized that Mesopotamian scribes worked within inherited bodies of knowledge that could be reorganized without losing sacred authority. A list could be adapted. A ritual could incorporate older figures. A myth could preserve a name whose original context had already changed. This means the sages may have acquired new meanings as political and religious institutions evolved. One open scholarly debate concerns how closely these sages were tied to historical learned professions. Some scholars see them as mythic models for priests, diviners, and scholars who claimed ancient wisdom. Others emphasize their supernatural nature and warn against reducing them to symbolic versions of human intellectuals. The distinction remains uncertain because ritual specialists themselves could identify strongly with divine or legendary predecessors. You can sense how attractive that lineage would be. A scholar working in a palace does not merely study difficult signs. He participates in a chain of knowledge stretching back toward the earliest age. His authority becomes older than any dynasty. He does not invent wisdom, he inherits it. This inheritance gives the sages a different kind of power from the rulers. A king commands a city, a sage carries knowledge that can survive the fall of cities. Political authority is visible in walls, armies, and tribute. Sacred knowledge travels more quietly through tablets, rituals, and trained memory. One can vanish, while the other continues. Perhaps that is why these figures linger so strongly in the imagination. They stand near the beginning of civilization, associated with knowledge that humanity does not originate by itself. The teaching comes from elsewhere. Whether from divine wisdom, mythic memory, or symbolic tradition, humans receive it. That pattern echoes through many ancient stories because it answers a difficult question. How did ordered knowledge begin? The 7 sages do not solve the mystery of the 8 primeval rulers. They make it more complicated. They introduce a second structure into the ancient landscape, one built around wisdom rather than reign length. Their number differs, their functions differ, their imagery differs. Yet they occupy the same hazy territory where civilization appears to emerge through contact with beings who are not entirely ordinary. The temple grows dim around their carved forms. Fish-covered figures stand beside human-like guardians, silent beneath centuries of dust. Their hands hold ritual objects whose meanings are only partly understood. Nothing in their posture looks hurried. They seem to belong to a system that expects to endure. And perhaps that is the important point. The old traditions do not present one simple group of hidden watchers. They preserve several overlapping classes of rulers, gods, sages, and guardians. Modern stories often compress them into a single secret. The ancient evidence does the opposite. It opens more doors than it closes, and behind each doorway another figure seems to be waiting in the half-light. The figures become stranger when you look closely at how they are represented. Some appear human at first glance, yet their outlines refuse to remain ordinary. A fish head rises above a human face, scales trail down the back, winged forms stand nearby. Other beings combine human bodies with animal features, while protective spirits wear expressions that feel calm rather than monstrous. These images were not scattered decoration. They were placed with purpose, often near thresholds, sacred rooms, or locations where protection mattered. You stand in a dim chamber lit by wavering flame. The walls hold reliefs cut with deliberate precision, and the air smells of dust, old stone, and resinous smoke. A figure beside the doorway seems to watch without moving. Its human features are framed by a fish skin that covers the body like a heavy mantle. The fish mouth rises above the forehead, the tail drops behind. What appears to be a disguise to modern eyes may have been something entirely different to the people who commissioned the image. Archaeologists have recovered many protective figurines from Mesopotamian sites, especially from buildings connected with elite or ritual life. Some were buried beneath floors or placed inside foundations where nobody living in the building would normally see them. Their hidden position is important. These objects were not primarily created for public display. Their power depended on presence rather than visibility. A guardian did not need to be admired, it needed to occupy the right place. This practice reveals a practical theology of protection. Dangerous forces were believed capable of entering houses, palaces, and temples through vulnerable boundaries. Doorways, corners, foundations, and beds could become points of concern, Protective beings were therefore positioned where danger might pass. Their forms carried symbolic strength. A creature combining human intelligence with animal power could represent a defensive presence more effective than an ordinary human guard. One well-known type of protective figure shows a human-like being covered by the body of a fish. Scholars often connect such imagery with sage traditions and ritual protection. The precise identities can vary, and interpretation depends on context, inscription, and period. Yet the association between these hybrid forms and sacred wisdom appears repeatedly. The fish does not simply make the figure strange. It places the being within a symbolic network connected with water, knowledge, purification, and the deep sources of order. The sensation changes when you imagine seeing such a figure in fresh colour. Ancient reliefs were not necessarily the pale stone surfaces preserved today. Paint could sharpen eyes, garments, feathers, and scales. Torchlight would move across painted details, causing the figure to seem less static. Shadows would lengthen around the fish head and wings. A visitor unfamiliar with the symbolism might feel unsettled. A trained priest might see reassurance. Records from excavated Mesopotamian buildings confirm that protective images were often deposited deliberately in architectural spaces. Their placement suggests planned ritual activity rather than accidental loss. Scholars studying these deposits have identified recurring combinations of figures associated with magical defense. This is important because it demonstrates that hybrid imagery belonged to organized religious practice. It was not merely the private fantasy of an artist carving unusual creatures. A curious detail lies in the fact that some guardians were deliberately hidden from human sight. Once buried beneath a floor, they remained invisible for centuries. Modern assumptions often connect sacred images with visual devotion, yet these figurines worked differently. Their concealment may have strengthened their ritual function. They guarded silently from within the structure itself, like supernatural sentries built into the architecture. This creates an intriguing reversal. Modern stories often imagine strange beings hiding themselves among humans. In Mesopotamian ritual, humans sometimes hide representations of strange beings beneath their own buildings. The concealment belongs to the protective object, not necessarily to the creature represented. Hidden presence becomes part of defense. You can feel the cold edge of a foundation trench beneath your fingers. A ritual specialist kneels beside a small clay figure. Words are spoken quietly. The figurine is placed carefully into position, then covered by earth and brick. Nobody passing through the room later will know exactly where it rests. The building appears ordinary, yet something sacred has been sealed inside it. Protection has become invisible architecture. Hybrid beings also appear in monumental art connected with royal power. Winged figures, human-headed creatures, and composite guardians stand near palace entrances. Their size can overwhelm the viewer. These forms communicate control over dangerous forces and access to supernatural protection. They remind visitors that royal space is not defended only by soldiers. It is protected symbolically by beings drawn from a world beyond ordinary nature. The combination of human and animal parts should not automatically be read as evidence that ancient artists believe such beings walk the streets physically. Composite imagery appears across many ancient cultures because it allows artists to communicate qualities through form. Wings suggest speed or celestial association. Animal strength can represent protection. Horns can indicate divine status. Fish elements can evoke water and wisdom. A hybrid body becomes a visual sentence. Still, the image of concealment remains difficult to ignore. A human face beneath a fish head looks surprisingly like someone wearing a costume. Some modern fringe interpretations seize upon this appearance and propose that the figure literally depicts a being hiding its true identity beneath an artificial outer shell. Others imagine ceremonial suits, survival equipment, or technologically advanced garments. these ideas are imaginative. But the archaeological context points much more strongly toward ritual symbolism and protective theology. The scholarly debate is more subtle. Researchers continue to examine whether some images represent supernatural beings directly, human ritual specialists dress to embody them, or artistic conventions that blur those categories. Ancient ceremonies sometimes involved costume, masks, and symbolic performance. Yet surviving art does not always tell us whether a depicted form was meant to be worn physically. An image can preserve ritual identity without documenting actual clothing. That ambiguity matters because disguise is not always deception. In ritual practice, changing appearance can mean transformation rather than concealment. A priest wearing symbolic garments may not be pretending to be something else. He may be temporarily representing a sacred role. The garment tells observers that ordinary identity has been suspended. The wearer becomes a bridge between human and divine categories for the duration of the ceremony. You notice how this changes the meaning of the fish covering. The human face remains visible, nothing is completely hidden. The figure seems to reveal two identities at once. Human intelligence remains present beneath the outer animal form. The imagery suggests overlap rather than replacement. This duality appears throughout ancient sacred art. Gods can be represented through symbols, statues, animals, stars, or human-like bodies without being reduced to any single form. A divine presence may have many visual expressions. The same principle can apply to sages and guardians. Their appearance does not need to describe anatomy. It can describe function. Perhaps that is why the figures remain so compelling. They stand in the space between image and being. You know they are carved stone or moulded clay, yet their placement tells you ancient people treated them as more than decoration. They defend thresholds, inhabit foundations, and embody wisdom. Their strange bodies carry meaning that survives even when the exact ritual language has faded. The room grows quieter as your eyes adjust to the darkness. A winged guardian stands beside a doorway. A fish-covered sage seems to emerge from shadow. Beneath the floor, unseen figurines remain where ancient hands placed them. None of these beings needs to move to create unease. Their power comes from stillness. You begin to understand that ancient disguise may not mean hiding a secret fate. It may mean wearing a form that reveals a deeper role. Fish, wings, horns, feathers, and animal bodies become layers of meaning placed over the human shape. The figure is not less visible because it is disguised. It is more visible in another language. And perhaps this is where the mystery becomes most delicate. A modern viewer sees a costume and asks who is underneath. An ancient viewer may have seen the same image and asked what sacred power is being expressed. The difference between those questions is enormous. One searches for a hidden body, the other searches for a hidden meaning. Disguise in the ancient world does not always mean deception. Sometimes it means entering another identity for a brief and carefully controlled moment. A garment, crown, mask, or animal skin can change the way a person is seen without hiding who they are in ritual settings. That change may carry sacred force. You do not simply put on clothing. You step into a role that belongs to a larger story, one understood by everyone watching. Imagine a ceremonial chamber before sunrise. The floor is cool beneath bare feet, and the air carries the scent of wool, oil, cedar, and burned incense. A ritual specialist stands beside folded garments prepared for use. Another attendant checks the ornaments, cords, and headpieces. Nobody hurries. Every object has a place, and every piece of clothing may communicate rank, duty, or divine association. Dressing becomes part of the ceremony itself. Ancient Mesopotamian art repeatedly uses clothing to distinguish ordinary people from rulers, priests, and divine beings. Certain crowns indicate authority. Horned headgear can identify divinity. Long robes, fringed garments, and carefully arranged hairstyles separate elite figures from common workers. These visual choices were not accidental. They formed a language that viewers could read, much as modern uniforms immediately suggest professions or institutions. This makes the idea of disguise more complicated. If a divine being is shown wearing a horned crown, the crown does not conceal identity. It reveals it. The object tells the viewer what kind of figure stands before them. A modern observer might focus on the physical object itself, but an ancient observer could understand the symbolic message instantly. Clothing becomes a declaration. The same principle can apply to animal skins. A fish covering might look like a costume designed to hide a body, yet its purpose may have been exactly the opposite. It identifies the wearer or depicted being with a particular realm, function, or sacred tradition. The outer form communicates something the human face alone cannot. The disguise reveals by covering. One mainstream historical fact helps call this interpretation. Mesopotamian visual culture used repeated symbols to identify divine and royal status across long periods. Scholars studying cylinder seals, reliefs, statues, and ritual objects have traced how headgear, posture, clothing, and attributes distinguish different categories of beings. These conventions change over time, but they remain structured enough to show that ancient artists expected viewers to recognize symbolic identity through appearance. You can see the logic in a crowded procession. Musicians move first, followed by attendants carrying offerings. Priests wear garments appropriate to their roles. A ruler approaches in clothing that separates him from those around him. Each figure occupies a visible position inside the social order. The procession becomes almost like a moving diagram as all fabric, jewelry, staffs, crowns, and ceremonial objects tell you who carries authority and who serves. Masks add another layer. Direct evidence for every kind of ritual mask is uneven, and scholars remain cautious about assuming that carved hybrid faces were copied from physical costumes. Yet masks are known across many ancient traditions as tools for changing identity during ceremony. They allow a human face to become something else without pretending that the transformation is permanent. The participant may remain human, but the role being performed belongs to another category. This creates a useful distinction between concealment and transformation. Concealment hides information. Transformation changes the meaning of what is visible. In ritual, the second may matter far more. A priest covered by an animal skin might not be trying to deceive observers into believing he's literally an animal. He may be embodying qualities associated with that creature, or representing a supernatural figure connected with it. A quirky fringe interpretation proposes that some ancient ceremonial clothing represents equipment rather than symbolism. Horned headgear becomes communication technology, layered garments become protective suits, masks become breathing devices. The theory is attractive because modern people are trained to see specialized clothing as functional technology. Firefighters, divers, surgeons, and astronauts all wear equipment that changes appearance dramatically. Ancient images can therefore trigger familiar modern associations. The problem is that resemblance alone does not establish function. A carved fish covering may look like a suit because you know what suits are. An ancient viewer may have understood it as a visual sign of sacred wisdom. Interpretation depends upon cultural context, not merely shape. The same object can look technological to one age and theological to another. Still, ancient ritual clothing could certainly have practical effects. Heavy garments alter movement. Masks change breathing and voice. Headgear increases height. Metal ornaments reflect light. Animal skins change silhouette and texture. In torchlit rooms filled with smoke and chanting. These physical changes would have been powerful. A familiar person could become difficult to recognize immediately, especially from a distance. You can hear sandals scraping across the floor as a costumed figure enters. The face is partly shadowed, Metal catches the flame. The robe moves more slowly than ordinary clothing, forcing deliberate steps. The effect is not loud, but it is unmistakable. The person seems to have crossed a boundary simply by changing how the body occupies space. This may explain why ritual dress often feels mysterious, even when everyone understands what is happening. Transformation does not require belief in literal shapeshifting. Human perception is sensitive to posture, voice, clothing, and context. Change those elements together, and the same person can feel profoundly different. The ancient ceremony uses that psychological fact without needing to name it. Scholars continue to debate how closely priestly costume can be reconstructed from surviving images. Some figures clearly represent supernatural beings rather than human performers. Others may show ritual specialists dressed in symbolic garments. The evidence is often too fragmentary to decide with certainty. Artistic convention can imitate costume, while costume can imitate sacred art. The relationship may run in both directions. Horned crowns illustrate the problem well. In art, they frequently mark divine identity. Yet this does not mean that every horned figure corresponds to a human wearing literal horns during a ceremony. The symbol can exist primarily within representation. A carved crown tells the viewer that the figure belongs to the divine realm, even if no physical version was ever worn in ordinary ritual. Animal imagery works similarly. Lions suggest power, bulls suggest strength, birds can suggest sky or speed, fish connect naturally with the water. When those forms are combined with human bodies, the result communicates multiple qualities at once. A hybrid figure becomes a visual compression of ideas. This helps explain why disguise can feel like concealment to modern viewers while functioning as revelation in ancient art. The outer layer does not hide the true identity, it expresses the identity more completely. A human face alone cannot show divine power, cosmic association or ritual function. Add the proper crown, a garment, a skin or wings, and the figure becomes legible. You might compare it with a judge wearing ceremonial robes. Everyone knows a human body is underneath. The clothing does not deceive anyone. It changes the meaning of the person in that setting. Remove the robe, and this individual remains the same yet the public role has disappeared. Ancient ritual dress may have worked through a similar principle, only with far stronger sacred associations. The unsettling possibility is not that people were secretly non-human. It is that ancient societies understood identity as more flexible than modern assumptions often allow. A person could be a private individual in one setting, a royal servant in another, and a sacred representative during ritual. Clothing helped mark those transitions. The chamber darkens as the lamps burn lower. A horned crown rests on a table. Folded cloth lies beside an animal's skin. None of these objects moves, yet each contains the possibility of changing how a person is perceived. Once worn, they create a new presence without erasing the human body beneath them. Perhaps disguise, in this older sense, is not about hiding from humanity. It is about showing humanity something that ordinary appearance cannot express. A sacred costume does not ask, "Who is secretly underneath it?" asks a stranger question. What becomes visible when an ordinary face is placed inside an extraordinary form? A divine image stands inside the temple, silent beneath lamplight. Yet the people tending it do not treat it as ordinary stone. Its eyes may be inlaid with shell or dark mineral. Its clothing can be changed. Its face receives careful attention. Food is brought into the chamber. Music is performed nearby. Doors open and close according to ritual schedules. To a modern visitor, the statue might appear to be a representation of a god within ancient Mesopotamian religion. The relationship can be more intimate. Under the right ritual conditions, the image becomes a place where divine presence is understood to dwell. You feel the temperature change as you enter the inner room. The air is cooler than the courtyard outside, and then the smell of oil mixes with cedar, wool, and cooked grain. Light reaches only a short distance from the lamps. The statue seems larger in shadow, not because it moves, but because everything around it is organized around its presence. Attendants do not behave as though they are caring for an ornament. They behave as though a resident of extraordinary rank occupies the chamber. This idea is crucial for understanding how a god could appear within human surroundings without needing to walk through the streets in an ordinary body. Divine presence could be mediated through a crafted form. The statue was made by human artisans, yet ritual transformed its status. The material remained wood, stone, metal, or composite substance, but the religious identity of the image changed. The object became more than the sum of its materials. Mesopotamian ritual texts preserve ceremonies often described by scholars as the opening of the mouth and washing of the mouth. These rites helped establish a cult image as a suitable dwelling for divine presence. The process involved purification, offerings, carefully controlled words, and symbolic separation from the human artisans who created the object. The message is subtle but powerful. Humans make the image. Yet the completed divine presence must not seem reducible to ordinary craftsmanship. A sculptor might carve the face, but ritual could deny that human hands alone created what worshippers encounter. This separation protects sacred identity. The god is not merely a product ordered from a workshop. The image becomes part of a larger process through which the divine enters a form prepared for it. Ancient theology therefore solves a difficult problem. How can an invisible or distant god inhabit the visible city through a body made ready for sacred residence? Researchers studying Mesopotamian religion have emphasized that cult statues were treated as active participants in temple life. They could receive meals, garments, jewelry, perfumes, and ceremonial journeys. Processions might carry divine images outside their sanctuaries during festivals. Political events could be interpreted through the presence or absence of statues. When enemies captured a city's divine image, the event could be understood not simply as theft, but as a terrifying disruption of the relationship between deity and community. This gives the statue a political importance that extends far beyond art. A conquered city deprived of its divine image loses more than valuable materials. It can feel abandoned. The removal of the god's earthly presence may symbolize the collapse of divine protection. Conversely, returning a captured statue can become an act of restoration, allowing the sacred order of the city to breathe again. You can imagine a procession moving slowly through a crowded street. People press against walls while attendants carry a richly adorned image beneath cloth and ornament. Musicians sound drums and stringed instruments. Incense thickens the air. Some viewers may see only glimpses between shoulders, yet the emotional meaning does not depend upon close inspection. The god is present within the community, travelling through human space in a form that can be carried, dressed, guarded, and welcomed. This creates a fascinating category of embodiment. The deity is not identical to the statue in a simple material sense, yet the statue is not merely a reminder. Sacred presence occupies an intermediate state. Modern language struggles with this because it prefers clear categories. Either something is a god or it is an object. Ancient ritual allows both dimensions to remain active at once. A quirky modern interpretation sometimes describes cult statues as containers, interfaces, or devices through which non-human beings communicated with worshippers. The vocabulary sounds technological because modern people are accustomed to screens, avatars, and remote presence. The comparison can feel surprisingly intuitive. Something absent can still act through a visible medium, yet ancient sources frame the process through ritual, divine embodiment, and sacred residence rather than mechanical transmission. The comparison nevertheless reveals why the idea fascinates modern audiences. A being does not need to reveal its ordinary form if it can occupy another one. A statue can become a face presented to humanity. The god remains larger than the visible image, yet the image provides a point of contact. Presence becomes localized without becoming limited. Scholars continue to debate exactly how Mesopotamians understood this relationship. Religious belief was not necessarily uniform across every city or century. Priests, rulers, craftsmen, and ordinary worshippers may have held slightly different assumptions. Ritual texts give us formal theology. While personal belief is harder to reconstruct, the statue's treatment strongly suggests sacred presence, but the precise metaphysical explanation remains partly beyond recovery. There is another strange detail. The divine image itself required protection. It could be damaged, stolen, neglected, or carried away. A god represented as powerful enough to influence kingdoms could still inhabit a vulnerable material form. This tension was not necessarily viewed as contradiction. The image belonged to the human world, where physical danger remained possible. Divine power did not make wood impossible to burn or stone impossible to break. That vulnerability may have increased the emotional importance of temple care. Priests became guardians of a divine body. Clothing needed maintenance. Offerings had to arrive. Purification had to be observed. The sacred presence depended upon an environment kept ritually appropriate. Daily attention preserved the relationship between city and deity. Your hand brushes the imagined surface of a temple wall, while a faint chant moves through the chamber. The statue ahead remains motionless, yet every action around it suggests personality. Meals arrive as though someone will receive them. Clothing is selected as though appearance matters. Music is played as though someone is listening. The ritual world behaves toward the image as toward a living sovereign whose needs cannot be ignored. This helps explain why ancient stories of divine appearance are not limited to gods descending visibly from the sky. Presence can take several forms. A deity might appear in a dream, speak through an omen, inhabit a cult image, or manifest through symbolic ritual. The divine does not need one permanent body. It can become perceptible through carefully prepared channels. The idea of disguise therefore changes once more. A statue is not disguise in the ordinary sense, because nothing is pretending to be something else. Yet it allows a divine identity to inhabit a form that conceals as much as it reveals. You see the face presented to worshippers, but you do not see the total being believed to stand behind it. Perhaps this is why the eyes of ancient statues can feel unusually intense. Large inlaid eyes are common in some Mesopotamian figures, especially in earlier periods. Modern viewers sometimes interpret them as expressions of permanent attention. The artistic convention likely reflects devotion, presence, and ritual focus rather than secret observation. Yet the effect remains powerful. The figure seems awake even when everything around it is still. Night settles over the temple complex. The public courtyard's empty and doors close one by one. Inside the sanctuary, attendants complete their final tasks while the image remains in darkness. No ordinary visitor stays to watch. The god's visible body rests within the chamber, surrounded by offerings, perfumes, and carefully maintained silence. It is possible that this form of sacred embodiment offers one of the oldest answers to a very human question. How can something unseen remain present among us? The Mesopotamian response is neither simple nor entirely metaphorical. Prepare a form, purify it, invite presence, treat it as inhabited, then live beside the mystery without demanding that the boundary between object and being become perfectly clear. Radiance becomes another kind of concealment in Mesopotamian imagination. A divine being does not always hide by becoming less visible. Sometimes the opposite happens. presence becomes so intense that ordinary perception fails. Light, brilliance, terror, majesty, and sacred power merge into an appearance that overwhelms the human observer. You do not lose sight of the god because nothing is there. You lose clear sight because too much seems to be there at once. The evening air is warm, and the upper terrace of a temple still holds the day's heat. A priest steps into the open while smoke rises from a brazier behind him. The sky is darkening, but the western horizon remains pale. Bronze catches the remaining light. Polished stone gleams briefly. Gold ornaments reflect small flashes from the lamps. In such surroundings, sacred brilliance is not difficult to imagine. Light itself becomes part of religious experience. Mesopotamian texts often describe gods through qualities that suggest splendor, fear, and overwhelming presence. Divine authority can be expressed as something visible enough to affect anyone standing nearby. A deity does not need to wear a simple human face. The presence surrounding that figure can be part of the identity. Radiance becomes a sign that the being belongs to a different level of existence. Scholars examining ancient Mesopotamian religion often discuss the concept of divine splendor as a force connected with awe and legitimate power. The exact words and meanings vary across periods, but the broader pattern is clear. Gods and kings can be represented through an atmosphere of extraordinary majesty. This quality is not merely decorative beauty, it can frighten enemies, impress subjects, and mark the boundary between ordinary humanity and sacred authority. You can understand the effect by imagining a ruler entering a darkened hall. Lamps burn along the walls, metal ornaments shine across his clothing. Musicians stop as he approaches, guards remain motionless, everyone already knows who he is. Yet the carefully arranged environment magnifies his presence. The man himself has not physically changed. Perception has changed around him. Ancient kings understood this language of display very well. Palaces, ceremonial clothing, monumental reliefs, and controlled access all helped transform political authority into sensory experience. A ruler might be physically ordinary, but architecture and ritual make him appear distant, powerful, and difficult to approach. Divine imagery works on an even greater scale. The god is not simply powerful, and the god is imagined as carrying an intensity that human bodies cannot comfortably withstand. One mainstream historical fact helps clarify this connection. Mesopotamian royal art frequently shows rulers and gods at different scales or with distinct symbols of status, size, position, headgear, and surrounding figures communicate hierarchy instantly. Ancient artists did not need realistic proportions to express authority. The visual system tells the viewer who matters most. Sacred radiance belongs to the same broader logic, where appearance communicates rank beyond ordinary physical description. This is where concealment becomes paradoxical. A being covered by darkness hides because you cannot see enough. A being surrounded by divine brilliance hides because you cannot see clearly. Both conditions prevent ordinary recognition. The result is similar, though the mechanism is opposite. The face disappears not behind a mask, but within excess. A quirky fringe interpretation takes descriptions of divine brightness literally and compares them with powerful artificial illumination. Some writers imagine technological sources of light, protective equipment, or intense energy surrounding advanced visitors. The resemblance can feel tempting because modern technology often associates brightness with machines, aircraft, laboratories, and electrical power. Yet ancient literature uses radiance widely as a language of divinity, kingship, glory, and fear, making a technological explanation unnecessary. The ancient symbolic interpretation is richer than it first appears. Light reveals and conceals at the same time. A bright flame allows you to see a room, Yet staring directly into it destroys detail. The sun illuminates the entire landscape, but you cannot comfortably gaze at its surface. Sacred brilliance follows that same logic. The divine presence makes reality visible while remaining difficult to inspect directly. You feel this most strongly when the night becomes completely dark. A single torch suddenly dominates everything nearby. Faces beyond its circle vanish, shadows grow longer, the flame creates knowledge and uncertainty together. Whatever stands close to the light becomes clear, while everything beyond becomes harder to judge. Ancient ritual spaces use this contrast naturally, whether intentionally symbolic or simply practical. Divine radiance may also help explain why certain supernatural figures are described as terrifying without behaving violently. Fear can come from presence alone. A person encountering something understood as sacred may tremble because the experience exceeds ordinary categories. The being does not need to attack. Its existence within the human space is enough to disturb the senses. Scholars continue to debate how literally ancient audiences imagined such descriptions. Some literary language may be poetic, designed to express status rather than physical light. Other passages may reflect ritual experiences involving fire, polished metals, reflective surfaces, or carefully staged temple ceremonies. The evidence does not force one interpretation. Sacred language often operates precisely because it can describe both sensation and meaning at once. The distinction matters when modern readers ask whether gods disguise themselves. If disguise means hiding a recognizable body beneath another appearance, the surviving traditions provide limited support. If disguise means becoming present through forms that prevent ordinary recognition, then the ancient material offers several possibilities. Radiance, terror, symbol, image, and ritual appearance can all interrupt the expectation of a simple face. You can imagine an observer standing at the edge of a procession as a divine image passes. Gold catches torchlight, musicians sound low notes, incense thickens the air, the crowd moves in controlled waves. For only a few seconds, the sacred figure is visible. Yet what the observer remembers may not be facial detail. He remembers brightness, sound, fragrance, distance, and the sensation of standing near something treated as more than human. This is important because memory preserves emotional intensity better than precise visual information. A person may remember that a presence seemed brilliant without being able to describe its features. Over generations, such descriptions can grow more symbolic. The god becomes radiant because radiance expresses the remembered feeling of encounter. Language expands where ordinary description fails. There is also a political dimension. Rulers who claim divine favour benefit from association with sacred brilliance. A king surrounded by splendour appears chosen, protected, and difficult to challenge. Ceremonial display can therefore imitate the sensory language of divinity without claiming that the ruler is physically glowing. Power borrows the atmosphere of heaven. The scent of incense grows thicker as the imagined ceremony continues. Bells or metal ornaments produce small sounds as attendants move. You glimpse polished surfaces through smoke. Nothing has vanished. Yet nothing appears completely stable either. The setting itself transforms perception. Perhaps this is why ancient radiance deserves more attention than modern stories of physical disguise. A mask asks what face lies underneath. Sacred brilliance asks whether a face can be understood at all. The mystery shifts from anatomy to perception. A god who appears as overwhelming light does not need to conceal identity deliberately. Human senses provide the concealment automatically. You see enough to know that something extraordinary is present, but not enough to reduce it to ordinary features. The boundary remains intact. The city sleeps beneath a sky crowded with stars, and the temple lamps continue burning behind closed doors. Somewhere within the sacred complex, gold, stone, smoke, and flame create a small world of controlled brightness. To those who enter, the divine may not be hidden by darkness, it may be hidden by splendor. Perhaps the oldest form of disguise was never a false face at all. It may have been the human inability to look directly at what was believed to be sacred, without just turning of experience into symbol. Light becomes majesty, fear becomes reverence, distance becomes mystery, and the being at the center remains visible, yet never completely seen. The priest stands in a difficult place, neither fully ordinary nor truly divine, but expected to move between those categories without losing his footing. He knows the rituals, the names, the sequences, the gestures, and those warnings that others do not. To the people outside the temple walls, that knowledge may seem almost supernatural, yet it is learned through discipline, repetition, and inherited tradition. The mystery does not lie only in what he believes. It lies in what he is permitted to know. You enter a narrow chamber where shelves hold clay tablets arranged in careful groups. The air smells of dust, oil, and old reeds. A young apprentice sits beneath a lamp, copying signs until his wrist aches. His teacher corrects a mistake with patient irritation. Sacred knowledge begins here, not in thunder, but in practice. Thousands of signs must be remembered. Ritual formulas must be preserved exactly. A single error can change the meaning of an entire line out. Mesopotamian temples depended upon trained specialists who performed different religious and scholarly duties. Some tended divine images, some interpreted omens, some conducted purification rituals, and others preserved complex written traditions. Their roles could overlap, but they were not interchangeable. This specialization matters because it created a hierarchy of knowledge. Ordinary worshippers could approach the divine world through offerings and prayer, while trained experts handled the more dangerous or technical boundaries. A diviner might examine an animal organ for signs connected with future events. Another specialist could interpret dreams. A ritual expert might prepare protective objects or recite words intended to remove harmful influence. Scribes copied collections that explained what unusual events might signify. None of this was casual. The work depended upon systems preserved across generations, giving the specialist authority rooted over ancient precedent. Researchers at institutions such as Yale and Oxford have studied the educational environments that produced Mesopotamian scribes. Surviving school tablets reveal exercises, copied vocabulary, literary passages, and mathematical problems. The evidence shows that literacy at the highest levels required long training. A person who mastered these materials gained access to a world hidden from most people, because the written tradition itself contained forms of memory unavailable through ordinary conversation. This may help explain why learned priests could be imagined as heirs to primeval wisdom. If ancient sages brought knowledge into the world, then later scholars could present themselves as guardians of that inheritance. Their authority did not depend only upon personal intelligence. It came from continuity. The specialist was valuable because he stood inside a chain that supposedly reached toward the deepest layers of sacred time. A quirky detail appears in how scholars sometimes identified themselves with legendary wisdom traditions. Later learned families could trace intellectual prestige through ancestral lines, professional titles, and revered teachers. The effect resembles membership in an invisible lineage. You inherit tablets, methods, interpretations, and responsibilities. The body grows old, but the knowledge passes onward. This kind of inheritance can blur the difference between representing a sage and becoming associated with one. A ritual specialist may recite words attributed to ancient figures. He may wear particular garments, handle symbolic objects, or perform actions believed to reproduce sacred patterns. During the ceremony, his personal identity becomes less important than the role he occupies. He is still human, yet the tradition allows him to stand in the place of something older. You can hear the whisper of fabric as he enters a room prepared for purification. Water waits in a vessel, incense burns low, a client sits quietly, perhaps frightened by illness, nightmares, or a sequence of troubling signs. The specialist does not improvise freely. He follows procedure. Words are spoken at the correct moment. Objects are placed deliberately. The ritual gains power from precision. To an outsider, this can look like performance. To a participant, it may feel like contact with an ordered, sacred system. The priest knows which boundary has been disturbed and how to repair it. His knowledge gives shape to fear. A strange dream becomes classifiable. A threatening omen becomes interpretable. Misfortune becomes something that can be addressed through action rather than endured in silence. This role creates social power. Anyone who claims access to hidden meaning can influence decisions, especially when rulers seek advice. Kings faced wars, succession problems, disease, rebellion, and uncertain harvests. A learned specialist could not command armies, but his interpretation might shape when those armies moved. Knowledge therefore became political without ceasing to be sacred. Scholars continue to debate how much independence such experts possessed at court. Some may have served royal interests closely, while others probably defended established ritual traditions even when inconvenient. Letters and scholarly texts suggest that court specialists sometimes offered cautious or unfavourable interpretations. Their authority depended upon being useful, but usefulness required credibility. A diviner who always told the king exactly what he wanted to hear would eventually become worthless. The relationship between ruler and specialist therefore contained tension. The king controlled resources and institutions. The scholar controlled access to certain forms of knowledge. Neither side was completely independent. The king needed interpretation, while the expert needed patronage and protection. Between them, sacred authority and political authority negotiated constantly. Modern fringe theories sometimes treat priests as members of a hidden organization preserving secret knowledge about non-human visitors. Ancient ritual vocabulary, unusual costumes, and claims of inherited wisdom are combined into stories of concealed bloodlines or covert guardians. The evidence does not support such a literal underground network. What does exist, however, is a genuine class of trained experts whose knowledge was inaccessible to most people. That reality may be enough to explain why later imagination turns them into keepers of secrets. Specialized knowledge always creates distance. If only a small group can read the tablets, interpret the signs, and understand the rituals, then everyone else must rely upon them. The boundary between expertise and mystery becomes thin. You can imagine a farmer standing outside a temple office while a scribe reads something he cannot. The farmer knows the marks contain meaning, but he cannot unlock it himself. The tablet might record grain, debt, a prayer, or an omen. To him, the surface remains sans until another person gives it a voice. Literacy itself can resemble hidden power when knowledge is unevenly distributed. The priestly scholar also lives under pressure. He must preserve inherited material accurately while adapting it to changing circumstances. Cities fall, dynasties disappear, languages shift, new rulers arrive with different priorities. Yet the old texts remain valuable because age gives them authority. The scholar becomes a bridge not only between gods and humans, but between centuries. This may be the most important form of disguise in the priestly world. Ancient wisdom survives inside ordinary human bodies. The expert looks like any other person walking through the city, yet he carries memorized formulas, sacred names, and interpretive systems unavailable to most people around him. Nothing in his face reveals the archive inside his mind. As night deepens, as the apprentice finishes copying a final line, his teacher checks the signs and nods. The lamp burns low. Outside, the temple courtyard is emptied, and the city settles into darkness. Inside the small room, another fragment of inherited knowledge has been preserved. Perhaps this is how the boundary between sage and priest becomes difficult to see. The legendary figure brings wisdom into the world. The human specialist keeps that wisdom alive. One belongs to sacred memory, the other to history, yet both occupy the same role as guardians of knowledge. Over juries, the distinction can soften until teacher, sage, priest, and divine representative seem to overlap. The mystery, therefore, does not require secret beings hiding beneath human skin. It can arise from a simpler and more ancient truth. A person may appear ordinary while carrying knowledge that places him close to powers others cannot understand. The disguise is social rather than physical. The face remains human, while the authority behind it reaches into a past that feels almost impossible to measure. The modern story changes when fragments from different ancient traditions begin to merge into one smooth narrative. A king from one tablet, a sage from another, a divine counsel from a third, and a hybrid figure from ritual art can suddenly appear to belong to a single hidden system. The result feels coherent because the gaps have been quietly removed. Yet those gaps matter. They are where history resists simplification, and where imagination begins doing work that the original sources never clearly asked it to do. You can picture the process happening almost invisibly. A reader encounters an ancient ruler with an impossible lifespan, then discovers a separate text describing divine beings who guide human affairs. Another image shows a fish-covered sage. A later writer places them together. Soon the ruler becomes a watcher, the sage becomes a disguised visitor, and the divine assembly becomes an organized group supervising humanity. Each step feels small. Together, they create an entirely different story. This is not unusual in the history of interpretation. Ancient material survives in fragments, and human beings naturally prefer continuity. Broken tablets are uncomfortable, contradictory traditions are untidy, missing explanations invite reconstruction. When several mysterious elements share similar themes, later readers connect them even when the original scribes may never have done so. The temptation is understandable because the reconstructed version often feels more satisfying than the damaged evidence itself. A mainstream historical fact is that Mesopotamian texts were produced across many centuries, cities, and political environments. Traditions associated with one period could be adapted by scribes living under very different rulers. Names could be preserved while functions changed. Stories could absorb older material. Religious centers could emphasize their own gods while retaining inherited themes. This long process means that two similar ideas are not automatically parts of one original document. The chronological distance can be enormous. A modern reader may encounter several ancient texts within minutes on a screen or printed page, making them feel contemporary with one another. In reality, centuries might separate their surviving versions. That distance can equal the gap between medieval Europe and the modern world. Combining them without caution is like treating every story written between those eras as one continuous eyewitness account. Your fingers move across imagined shelves filled with clay tablets from different places. One comes from a temple archive, another belongs to a palace collection, a third preserves a school exercise. Their surfaces look similar because all are clay, but their purposes differ. One records a ritual, another lists rulers, another explains omens. Material similarity can hide intellectual distance. Modern alternative histories often remove that distance. They create a unified timeline in which every unusual ancient figure belongs to the same group. This is especially common with the word watcher. It sounds neutral enough to gather many different beings under one label. A god who observes, a guardian protecting a doorway, a sage advising a king, and a ruler from the primeval age, can all become watchers through modern vocabulary. The word itself creates an illusion of ancient consistency. Once applied repeatedly, it begins to feel as though the original sources used the same category. Often, they did not. Translation choices matter. Modern labels can flatten distinctions that were obvious to ancient readers. A protective spirit is not automatically a divine ruler. A sage is not automatically a god. A king with a legendary lifespan is not automatically a hidden observer. A quirky feature of modern fringe literature is how frequently visual resemblance becomes evidence. A carved object looks like a helmet, so it becomes a helmet. A wing resembles machinery, so it becomes flight technology. A fish skin resembles a suit, so it becomes protective equipment. This method feels intuitive because modern people interpret unfamiliar objects through familiar ones, yet resemblance without context can produce almost any conclusion. The same problem appears with language. A phrase about descent from heaven can be read as physical travel. A reference to divine creation can become biological engineering. Sacred knowledge becomes advanced science. Each reinterpretation moves ancient imagery into a modern conceptual system. The new story may be creative, but it should not be mistaken for a direct translation of what ancient writers intended. Scholars debate where responsible reconstruction should stop and speculation should begin. This is especially difficult when texts are damaged. A missing line can sometimes be restored from parallel copies, but other gaps remain uncertain. Historians may propose possibilities while clearly marking them as tentative. Popular retellings often remove those cautions because uncertainty slows the story. The result sounds more confident than the evidence allows. You can feel the attraction of certainty. 8 beings watching humanity is a stronger statement than several traditions containing 8 rulers, 7 sages, divine assemblies, and protective spirits. The first gives you a secret. The second gives you a puzzle. Secrets promise revelation. Puzzles demand patience. Modern media encourages this compression because striking claims travel easily. A title asking whether several ancient traditions may have influenced one another sounds cautious. A title declaring that a tablet describes hidden beings sounds immediate and memorable. The stronger claim attracts attention, even when the underlying evidence remains ambiguous. Curiosity is natural, certainty is marketable. This does not mean every alternative interpretation is worthless. Speculation can sometimes ask useful questions that academic habits overlook. Unusual comparisons may draw attention to forgotten texts, overlooked images, or numerical patterns. The problem begins when possibility becomes declaration. A question can open inquiry. A confident claim can close it too early. You can imagine a reader encountering the material for the first time. The ancient world feels distant, and specialized scholarship can seem intimidating. A simple theory offers relief. Suddenly, every fragment fits. There are beings. They arrive. They supervise. They disguise themselves. The story becomes easy to remember because it follows modern nowadays expectations. But ancient Mesopotamia rarely behaves so neatly. Its gods argue. Its traditions overlap. Its cities compete. Its scribes preserve contradictions without embarrassment. A figure can hold different roles in different texts. A myth can change across generations. The ancient record is not a single secret file waiting to be decoded. It is a library built by many hands. That complexity may be more unsettling than a simple conspiracy. A conspiracy gives you a hidden answer. Fragmented tradition gives you no guarantee that one answer ever existed. The people who created these texts may themselves have inherited material they did not completely understand. Memory can preserve structure while losing explanation. Meaning can survive partially, altered by centuries of use. The transformation of ancient figures into modern watchers therefore tells you something about the present as well as the past. Modern culture is fascinated by hidden systems, secret observers, and beings operating behind ordinary appearances when ancient images contain ambiguity. Those modern fears and hopes move easily into the empty spaces. The past becomes a mirror. You hear the faint scrape of a page turning in a modern study, far from the ancient cities where the original clay was pressed. A writer pauses over a translation. One phrase seems suggestive. Another image looks familiar. Connections begin forming. Some are careful, others are imaginative. Soon the distance between evidence and interpretation becomes difficult to see. Perhaps this is how hidden histories are created. Not through deliberate fraud in every case, but through accumulation. One possibility becomes a repeated claim. One comparison becomes a conclusion. One modern term is applied to several ancient categories. Eventually, the reconstructed story begins to feel older than it truly is. The ancient material remains patient beneath all of this. It does not protest. Clay cannot correct the reader. It simply preserves what was written, along with every silence surrounding it. The challenge is learning to listen to both. The clay itself is less dramatic than the stories built around it, and that's precisely why it deserves careful attention. When you return to the surviving wording, the mystery becomes narrower but also more interesting. The tablet does not present 8 disguised observers walking unnoticed among ordinary people. It does not describe the transformations, hidden faces, or a covert mission to monitor humanity. What it preserves is stranger in a different way. It gives a structured sequence of 8 primeval rulers who govern before a catastrophic flood, and it places them inside a sacred chronology where ordinary human limits no longer seem to apply. You sit beneath a steady lamp while a transliteration lies open nearby. The room is quiet enough to hear the faint movement of paper against wood. Each sign must be handled carefully, because translation is not simply replacing one word with another. Ancient expressions carry cultural assumptions that modern English cannot always reproduce neatly. A title may imply political rank, sacred authority, or both. A city name can carry religious associations lost to the casual reader. Even a numerical formula may belong to conventions that no longer survive outside specialist study. The surviving king list is fundamentally a list. That sounds obvious, but the form matters. It does not behave like a narrative in which characters explain themselves. It moves through places, rulers, reigns, and transfers of authority. The style is compact. It rarely pauses to describe motives or appearance. This means modern readers receive names without faces and durations without biographies. The silence around each ruler creates space. But that space should not be mistaken for hidden information preserved elsewhere in the same text. Mainstream scholarship treats the earliest portion as legendary or mythological in character, especially because the reigns are vastly beyond human possibility. Later parts move closer to rulers who can be connected with historical evidence. The text therefore bridges different kinds of remembered time. Its structure matters more than any single sensational claim. It presents continuity, suggesting that kingship passes through an ordered sequence, even when individual rulers belong to very different levels of historical certainty. Nothing in the surviving wording says that the 8 rulers are a species. Nothing identifies them as visitors from another world. Nothing says they adopt human bodies to conceal their identities. These ideas belong to later interpretation rather than direct statement. That distinction may feel disappointing for a moment, but it is actually useful. Once unsupported details are removed, you can see the genuine puzzle more clearly. Why were these rulers placed at the beginning of ordered civilizations, and why were their reigns made so immense? You trace the marks with your eyes and notice how much depends upon what is absent. A modern storyteller wants scenes. What did these rulers look like? What did they teach? Did they fear death? Did people worship them? Did they travel? The tablet answers none of these questions directly. It behaves almost stubbornly to preserving structure while withholding personality. The ancient scribe appears more interested in legitimacy and sequence than in satisfying curiosity. A quirky feature of modern retellings is the tendency to turn silence into evidence. If the text does not explain a ruler's body, some readers suggest the body was deliberately concealed. If a figure has an extraordinary lifespan, the absence of explanation becomes proof of unusual biology. This reasoning is seductive because mystery encourages completion, yet missing detail can simply be missing detail. Ancient lists often omit exactly the kinds of personal description modern audiences expect. The same caution applies to the word beings. Calling the 8 figures beings is technically broad enough to sound harmless, but it changes the emotional tone. A ruler sounds political, a being sounds mysterious. Once the language shifts, the imagination follows. A list of rulers can become a list of entities, and entities can quickly become watchers. The transformation occurs in modern phrasing rather than ancient clay. Scholars openly debate how these rulers should be understood within the development of Mesopotamian historical thought. Some emphasize the ideological function of constructing a single line of legitimate kingship. Others explore the possibility that older local traditions were gathered and arranged into a broader framework. Another question concerns how much symbolic meaning lies in the reign lengths themselves. These debates are serious precisely because the text does not provide an explanatory commentary. You can feel the difference between evidence and reconstruction as clearly as 2 layers of clay. The evidence gives names, cities, numbers, and a sequence. Reconstruction asks why they are arranged this way. Speculation asks whether the rulers were non-human observers. Imagination asks how they might have disguised themselves. These levels can coexist in storytelling, but these should not be confused. The temptation to combine them is strongest when later Mesopotamian material introduces sages, divine councils, ritual guardians, and complex ideas about divine presence. Once those elements sit beside the king list, connections begin to suggest themselves. Yet similarity does not prove identity. Ancient cultures could maintain several overlapping systems of sacred authority without intending them to describe one single hidden group. This is a familiar problem in historical research. A later tradition may illuminate an earlier one, but it can also distort it. Concepts change across centuries. A name can acquire new associations. A ritual figure can be linked with an older legendary king long after both traditions have developed independently. Responsible interpretation must allow influence without assuming total continuity. You hear the soft tap of a stylus against a reconstructed writing board in your imagination. The scribe is not trying to trick you. He writes within conventions familiar to his own world. The difficulty lies in the distance between his assumptions and yours. He expects readers to understand why kingship matters, why certain cities carry prestige, and why extraordinary numbers can belong to sacred time. Modern readers arrive without that shared framework, so the empty spaces feel larger. There is also no surviving passage in the king list explaining how these rulers observed humanity. The idea of watching belongs more naturally to divine oversight, guardianship, omen traditions, and modern reinterpretation. The 8 rulers themselves are not described performing surveillance. Their relationship to humanity is through rule. They govern cities. That is the clear function preserved in the list. Nor does the text explain any method of disguise. No shape-changing sequence appears, no hidden identities are revealed, no clothing is described as camouflage. The later fascination with fish coverings, hybrid imagery and sacred costumes, and divine embodiment comes from other bodies of evidence. Those traditions remain valuable, but they should not be folded silently into the king list as though every element appeared on one tablet. This separation may seem to weaken the mystery, yet it actually sharpens it. The authentic ancient question is not whether 8 watchers possessed secret disguises. It is why Mesopotamian scribes imagined an ordered age of rulers so distant from normal human experience that their reigns become almost cosmic. That question belongs completely to the ancient material. Perhaps the primeval sequence preserves a theological map of authority. Perhaps it organizes old city traditions into a single sacred past. Perhaps the enormous reigns mark a world fundamentally different from later history. It is possible that several of these explanations work together. Ancient scribes rarely needed the clean boundaries modern categories demand. The room grows quieter as the lamp lowers. The translated lines remain plain on the page, almost frustratingly plain. 8 rulers, 5 cities, impossible durations, a sacred institution moving through deep time. No disguised watchers step from the shadows. And yet the absence of that claim does not make the tablet ordinary. It makes the real mystery more disciplined. You're no longer chasing a statement that the clay never makes. You're standing before something older and stranger, a record that places human kingship inside a chronology beyond human scale, then leaves the meaning suspended in silence. 8 still feels important. Even when you resist giving the number a meaning the surviving evidence cannot support. Human minds notice arrangement instinctively, and ancient scribes were no less attentive to structure. 8 rulers are placed within 5 cities, their reigns measured with extraordinary precision, their authority transferred through an ordered sequence. The pattern creates the impression of design. Something has been organized deliberately, even if the purpose behind that organization remains partly hidden. Numbers in Mesopotamia belong to more than counting. They helped organize land, wages, grain, architecture, astronomy, calendars, and ritual life. Scribal education trained students to work comfortably with numerical systems that can feel unfamiliar today. 60 held particular mathematical importance, alongside related units and multiples. This numerical tradition still touches modern life whenever you divide an hour into 60 minutes or a circle into 360 degrees, although those later conventions have complex histories. You can picture a student sitting beside a low table, pressing columns of calculations into damp clay. His fingers are stained with mud. The teacher watches closely while quantities are converted and multiplied. A wrong sign means beginning again. Mathematics here is not mysterious decoration. It is professional knowledge, necessary for administration and respected precisely because it brings order to difficult problems. This makes the primeval chronology especially interesting. The large reigns contain numerical relationships that fit Mesopotamian mathematical habits. Their values are not simply extravagant phrases such as countless years or ages beyond memory. They are stated as quantities. Someone cared enough to give the distant past arithmetic form. The forgotten age is therefore not presented as shapeless chaos. It is measured. Records confirm that Mesopotamian scribes frequently used lists to classify and organize knowledge. They produced lexical lists, professional lists, geographical lists, divine lists, omen collections, and royal sequences. Classification was one of the great intellectual habits of the scribal world. To place something into a sequence was to make it intelligible. The universe could be enormous and unpredictable, yet the tablet offered rows, categories, and names, and order. The 8 rulers belong naturally within this culture of arrangement. Their significance may therefore lie partly in completeness rather than personality. Each occupies a position in a chain, remove one figure, and the inherited structure changes. The individual names matter, but the sequence itself may carry equal weight. There is a gentle irony here. Modern audiences often search the list for secret biographies, while the ancient compiler may have been interested primarily in institutional continuity. You want to know whether one ruler possessed unusual knowledge, or another concealed and extraordinary identity. The scribe may simply want kingship to move correctly from place to place. Ancient bureaucracy has a remarkable talent for surviving our most imaginative questions. Still, the number 8 invites comparison because numbers frequently acquire symbolic meanings in religious traditions. Modern fringe theories sometimes claim that 8 represents a specific council of non-human overseers. Others connect it with astronomical arrangements, hidden geometries, or later religious symbols. Such comparisons can be intriguing, but resemblance across distant traditions does not establish a historical connection. A number can recur for many reasons, especially when the number itself is small. The stronger pattern lies within the Mesopotamian material. The rulers form a bounded primeval group. Their world has a beginning, an internal order, and a catastrophic limit. This gives them collective identity even without describing them as a biological or supernatural class. They belong together because the chronology places them together. You sense the pattern almost physically when the names are imagined as marks arranged down a tablet. One follows another. The eye travels downward, a city changes, another reign is counted, the repetition creates rhythm. Ancient lists can seem dry when read quickly, yet repetition can also produce solemnity. The structure begins to resemble a ritual recitation. Perhaps listeners once heard such sequences aloud. Literacy was limited, and written knowledge often entered social life through spoken performance. A sequence of ancient names could therefore carry sound as well as information. Each ruler would arrive through the human voice, followed by an enormous duration that pushed the audience farther into sacred distance. The cities contribute another layer of structure. 5 places receive the institution of kingship, but they do not hold it simultaneously within the narrative sequence. Authority moves. This movement creates a map of legitimacy across the landscape. The chosen cities become stations through which sacred political order travels. Why these particular cities were included remains an important question. Some held major religious significance. Some carried traditions that may have been older than the surviving copies. Their arrangement could reflect inherited local memories combined by the later scribes. It might also serve ideological purposes by presenting political supremacy as something transferable according to a larger order. Scholars continue to debate the precise history of the king list's composition. Different surviving manuscripts contain variations, reminding you that there was no single untouched version passing perfectly through time. Scribes copied, arranged, and transmitted material within changing political circumstances. This complicates any claim that every feature of one surviving version reflects an original primeval system. Variation is not failure. It provides evidence of development. When manuscripts disagree, historians can sometimes glimpse the process by which tradition was shaped. A changed sequence, omitted ruler, or altered number may reveal how scribes understood the material in different periods. The text becomes a living intellectual object rather than a frozen message. You can imagine several tablets laid side by side beneath museum lighting. Tiny differences appear between them. One preserves a line another lacks. Another has damage where a crucial sign should stand. A third offers a variant spelling. The hidden system, if there is one, must be reconstructed from imperfect witnesses. This is why claims about exactly 8 supernatural watchers require caution. The neatness of the number can create false confidence. A bounded group feels intentional, and intentionality feels like evidence of a secret category. Yet the ancient category explicitly preserved is royal succession. Anything beyond that requires additional argument. There is nevertheless something meaningful about the repeated movement from multiplicity toward order. Many rulers become one sequence. Several cities become one line of kingship. Vast spans become countable totals. The scribal mind takes an almost unimaginable past and makes it manageable through structure. Perhaps that is the deeper system being reconstructed, not a hidden organization of disguised observers, but an ancient philosophy of history. Civilization does not appear randomly. Authority has an origin. Cities receive it in sequence. Time is divided into meaningful stages. Catastrophe separates one condition of existence from another. Such a system would have offered reassurance as well as legitimacy. Dynasties collapse, yet kingship survives. Cities lose supremacy, yet political order continues somewhere else. Individual rulers disappear, yet the institution seems older than every kingdom that temporarily possesses it. The pattern makes historical instability feel like part of something permanent. Your eyes return to the number 8. It remains there, neither meaningless nor fully explained. Perhaps it reflects inherited tradition. Perhaps numerical aesthetics helped shape it. Perhaps 8 remembered figures were available to the compiler, and no deeper symbolism was intended. The evidence permits questions more easily than conclusions. Outside the imagined scribal room, evening settles across the plain. The smell of garden herbs drifts from a courtyard while someone closes a wooden gate. Inside, the tablet holds its orderly sequence against the disorder of time. Cities can erode, languages can disappear. Political systems can become dust. A carefully arranged list can survive them all. 8 names therefore endure because someone believed their order mattered. Whether the significance was theological, mathematical, political, literary, or several things at once remains uncertain. The number does not prove the existence of watchers, it proves something quieter. Ancient minds looked towards an immeasurably distant past and found not emptiness, but structure. Perhaps that is why the sequence continues to feel deliberate. You sense a system without possessing its complete instructions. The pattern is visible, while the reason for the pattern remains partly concealed. 8 rulers stand inside that arrangement like stones marking an ancient road. And the road itself disappears into a landscape no living person remembers. The catastrophe enters with almost no ceremony. The world of immense rains, sacred cities, and primeval rulers suddenly reaches a boundary that cannot be negotiated. Water becomes the dividing line. In Mesopotamian memory, the flood does not merely destroy buildings and lives, it separates one kind of time from another. The ages before it feel vast, remote, and almost beyond ordinary mortality. The ages that follow begin to resemble history as human beings can recognize it. You hear rain striking packed earth and reed roofs, then the deeper sound of water moving where streets should be. Mud walls soften, courtyards fill, livestock panic against their enclosures. Boats strain against ropes while families climb toward higher ground. Southern Mesopotamia is a land shaped by rivers, and everyone living there understands that water can sustain civilization or undo it. The same channels that nourish fields can become pathways of destruction when the balance changes. Archaeology confirms that major settlements in ancient Mesopotamia experienced serious flooding at different periods. Excavations at sites such as Shuruppak, Kish, and revealed flood deposits. Although they belong to different dates and local circumstances, this matters because the physical landscape itself offered repeated experiences from which powerful flood traditions could grow. There is no need to imagine one single event covering the entire planet to understand why catastrophic water became central to regional memory. A river plain can deceive you with its flatness. The horizon appears calm and the ground seems stable. Yet stability here depends upon constant management. Silt builds up, channels shift, embankments require repair. A breached levee can send water across fields and settlements with frightening speed. The landscape is productive because it is dangerous, and danger is woven into the same system that feeds the population. The ancient flood therefore carries both environmental and theological weight. Water destroys because nature can overwhelm human planning. Water also destroys because stories interpret catastrophe through divine intention. A flood that sweeps away houses becomes more than hydrology when survivors ask why it happened. Human beings rarely leave disaster without explanation. Memory searches for meaning almost as urgently as bodies search for dry ground. Mesopotamian flood traditions preserve several versions of that search. In some accounts, the gods decide that humanity must be destroyed. A chosen individual receives warning and survives through a carefully prepared vessel. Animals, family members, craftsmen, or supplies may be gathered depending on the version. The details vary, but the structure remains familiar. Destruction arrives, survival becomes selective, and a new human order emerges from water. One quirky detail is how practical some parts of the flood preparations can feel. Measurements for materials, provisions, and construction instructions appear beside divine decisions. Cosmic catastrophe meets logistics. Someone must seal the vessel, someone must store food, someone must decide what can be carried. Even myth cannot entirely escape administration in Mesopotamia. That mixture gives the story unusual texture. You're not simply watching gods pronounce judgment from a distant realm. You're watching human beings prepare wood, bitumen, containers, and supplies while the threat approaches. The sacred and practical remain intertwined. Survival depends upon obedience, but also upon workmanship. Scholars continue to debate how different Mesopotamian flood traditions relate to one another and to memories of real disasters. Some emphasize literary borrowing and adaptation across centuries. Others examine environmental evidence for severe regional floods that may have inspired parts of the stories. The surviving texts do not allow a single simple reconstruction. Myth, memory, theology, and local experience may all have contributed. The most striking change comes in the scale of time. Primeval rulers occupy reigns measured in impossible spans, but post-flood kings gradually belong to shorter durations. The transition is not perfectly smooth in every manuscript, yet the broad movement is clear. The flood acts like a gate closing behind an extraordinary age. You can feel that gate in the rhythm of the chronology. Vast numbers once created distance between ruler and ordinary mortality. Then catastrophe interrupts the sequence. The world that emerges is still filled with gods, omens, sacred kingships, and legendary heroes. But time begins to tighten. Rulers look increasingly human because their reigns approach lengths that bodies and dynasties can actually sustain. This transformation suggests that the flood does more than destroy. It normalizes. The conditions of the ancient world appear to change. Human existence becomes shorter, more fragile, and more familiar. The enormous ages belong on the far side of the water, where memory cannot easily return. Modern fringe theories sometimes interpret this shift as evidence of a biological or political transition. Some propose that long-lived non-human rulers withdrew after the catastrophe, leaving ordinary humans to govern. Others imagine that the flood ended direct supervision by advanced beings. These interpretations create a dramatic explanation for the change in chronology, but the tablets do not explicitly state such a transfer of species or hidden administration. A mythological explanation is more firmly grounded. Catastrophe frequently separates cosmic ages in ancient storytelling. The world before disaster is different because it belongs to sacred time. The world afterward becomes closer to the audience's own experience. Flood, fire, darkness, or divine conflict can mark the boundary. In Mesopotamia, water performs that work with special force because water already governs everyday survival. There is also a psychological truth within this pattern. Communities often divide memory around disaster. People speak of life before the flood, Before the war, before the earthquake, before the collapse, catastrophe creates a calendar even when nobody intends it to. Everything is measured against the moment when normal life ended. You imagine survivors stepping onto mud that no longer resembles the land they knew. Walls have collapsed into shapeless heaps, dead reeds cling to branches, household objects lie far from their original rooms, familiar paths have vanished beneath silt. The silence is different because ordinary routines no longer exist. A landscape can remain geographically recognizable while feeling like another world. For those survivors, the past immediately becomes distant. A house standing yesterday is now a memory. A neighbour seen days ago may be gone. A field cultivated for years can disappear beneath sediment. Disaster compresses history with brutal efficiency. What came earlier starts to feel almost legendary because the physical evidence has been rearranged. This may help explain why the antediluvian age becomes so immense in later tradition. The flood provides a perfect barrier behind which extraordinary chronology can accumulate. Once a world is placed beyond catastrophe, its rulers no longer need to obey the same conditions as current kings. Their time can expand because direct comparison becomes impossible. The flood also protects mystery. Nobody can easily verify what existed on the far side of total destruction. Lost cities, ancient rulers, vanished customs, and divine relationships can all be imagined as fundamentally different. Water becomes not only a destroyer of civilization, but a destroyer of evidence. That idea has encouraged speculation for centuries. What if libraries disappeared? What if unknown cities were buried beneath sediment? What if traditions preserve echoes of communities archaeologists have not yet found? Such questions are reasonable in limited form because archaeology continually reveals forgotten settlements. The danger comes when possibility is treated as proof of whatever vanished civilization one already hopes to find. The ancient flood story itself does not need a hidden technological society to create loss. Mud brick cities are vulnerable. Organic materials decay. Rivers change course. Archives burn, scatter, or dissolve. Entire generations can disappear from written memory through ordinary destruction. Human history contains enough absence without inventing perfect erasure. You stand quietly as the imagined waters begin to recede. The surface reflects a pale sky. Broken timbers appear first, then patches of ground. Birds return cautiously. Somewhere, survivors test the earth beneath their feet. Life continues, but it does not resume exactly where it stopped. The primeval rulers now belong to the drowned side of chronology. They remain named, but the world that contained them is sealed behind catastrophe. Their extraordinary durations feel appropriate there because everything beyond the flood has become structurally different. Perhaps this is why the flood occupies such a powerful place in the hidden timeline. It does not explain the strange age, it prevents the strange age from needing complete explanation. The water draws a line across memory and leaves everything beyond it difficult to measure. A new world begins beneath quieter skies. Kings still rise, cities still compete, priests still interpret divine will, yet the impossible scale has begun to collapse toward ordinary human time. The flood has washed away more than settlements. It has carried away the conditions under which the oldest rulers could exist. The idea of hidden watchers survives because it speaks to something older than any single tablet. Human beings have always wondered whether unseen powers observe their choices. The form changes across cultures, but the feeling remains strangely familiar. Gods look down from heaven. Ancestors remain present in memory. Spirits guard thresholds. Kings claim divine approval. Priests interpret signs. Modern stories replace temples with laboratories. Divine councils with secret organizations. And sacred disguises with ordinary human faces. The language changes, yet the unease remains. Your mind drifts through a quiet city at night. Windows glow faintly behind curtains. Footsteps pass along a street and disappear around a corner. A stranger pauses beneath a lamp, then continues walking. Nothing about the scene is unusual, but once the idea of concealment enters your thoughts, every ordinary face becomes slightly uncertain. This is how imagination works. It does not need evidence to begin, it only needs a gap. Ancient cultures offered many such gaps. A god could appear through dreams, omens, statues, visions, or unusual natural events. A sage might arrive from a remote place carrying knowledge. A ruler could claim ancestry connected with the divine. A priest might wear clothing that altered his identity during ritual. None of these traditions require secret beings hiding inside human society. Yet together they create a world where identity is not always fixed. That fluidity becomes fertile ground for later speculation. Modern people are accustomed to the idea that appearance can conceal intention. Espionage, political intrigue, disguises, false identities, and hidden institutions belong to familiar stories. When ancient texts describe beings whose true nature is difficult to define, modern readers naturally import the same ideas. A divine messenger becomes an infiltrator, a sacred costume becomes camouflage, a mysterious teacher becomes an observer. There is a mainstream historical reason such interpretations spread easily. Ancient literature survives unevenly, and incomplete evidence encourages narrative reconstruction. Archaeologists can recover walls, objects, inscriptions, and fragments, but rarely the entire world that gave them meaning. Scholars work carefully with those fragments. Yet popular imagination often moves faster. Where history says uncertain, storytelling says perhaps. Where scholarship says several interpretations remain possible, modern myth often chooses the most dramatic one. A curious detail is that hidden observer stories often become more popular during periods of rapid technological change. When societies experience surveillance systems, artificial intelligence, satellites, facial recognition, or constant digital tracking, ancient watchers begin to feel unexpectedly modern. People look backward and recognize their own anxieties in older symbols. The past becomes a screen upon which the present projects its fears. This does not mean those fears are foolish. Observation changes behavior. People act differently when they believe someone is watching. Ancient oath-taking already understood that principle. Modern psychology confirms that perceived observation can influence social conduct, even when the observer is symbolic. The human mind is extremely sensitive to the possibility of being seen. You can feel the difference immediately. Imagine speaking alone in a room. Then imagine a silent figure standing behind you. The words change, your posture changes, awareness sharpens. Nothing about your body is physically transformed, yet the possibility of observation alters experience. This response is ancient because social life depends upon knowing who sees what. Religious traditions often turn that social instinct toward the supernatural. Divine witnesses extend moral attention beyond human limits. A hidden action may still matter because the gods know. A private promise may remain binding because sacred powers heard it. Such beliefs create a moral universe in which secrecy is never complete. Modern fringe theories reshape this older pattern into physical surveillance. Instead of gods possessing supernatural knowledge, advanced beings monitor humanity through hidden methods. Instead of sacred presence, there is technological observation. The structure remains remarkably similar. Humanity is watched by powers possessing greater knowledge. Human beings do not fully understand their motives. The watchers intervene only occasionally. Their existence explains mysteries that ordinary people cannot solve. The appeal lies partly in asymmetry. A watcher knows you, but you do not know the watcher. That imbalance creates tension because knowledge becomes power. The watched person cannot easily judge intention. Protection and control can look similar from below. Scholars debate why cultures repeatedly produce supernatural observer figures. Some explanations emphasize social control and suggesting that belief in unseen witnesses helps reinforce cooperation and moral rules. Others focus on cognitive tendencies, including the human habit of detecting agency behind uncertain events. Another perspective emphasizes narrative psychology. A world with observers feels more meaningful than a world where events happen without attention. None of these explanations needs to eliminate religion or mythology. Human beliefs can have social functions while remaining deeply sincere. A person may genuinely feel watched by a deity and also behave differently because of that belief. Cultural meaning and psychological effect can exist together. You hear a distant bell in your imagined city. The sound travels between buildings and fades. Somewhere, someone looks toward the sky. Another person closes a door. Tin, an ordinary night continues beneath an extraordinary possibility. Perhaps someone is watching. That sentence works because it leaves space. It does not tell you who watches, why they watch, or whether the watcher exists. The uncertainty itself creates the feeling. Ancient myths are powerful partly because they preserve that space, rather than filling every gap. The human face becomes especially important in modern retellings. If a supernatural being can disguise itself, the most effective disguise is not an animal form or radiant body, it is familiarity. The watcher looks ordinary. It passes unnoticed because nothing appears strange. This idea tells you more about modern anxiety than ancient theology. Contemporary life depends upon strangers sharing cities, transportation, workplaces, and digital spaces. You routinely encounter people whose histories you do not know. Most are simply other human beings living ordinary lives. Yet fiction transforms that anonymity into possibility. Anyone could be hiding something. The ancient world knew anonymity differently. Cities could be crowded, but social networks were often structured through households, occupations, temples, and neighborhoods. A stranger still carried significance. Travelers, merchants, soldiers, envoys, and foreigners entered communities with uncertain intentions. Stories naturally developed around hidden identity because unfamiliar people always raise questions. Myths use that uncertainty beautifully. A god may appear as someone ordinary to test hospitality. A messenger may arrive unnoticed. A ruler may conceal rank. Such stories remind listeners that appearances cannot reveal everything about a person. The supernatural element intensifies an everyday truth. A quirky fringe tradition sometimes claims that certain bloodlines preserve non-human ancestry and allow watchers to remain hidden within elite families. The evidence for such claims is absent, but the story persists because lineage offers continuity. It solves a narrative problem. If ancient beings still exist, how have they remained present for thousands of years? Hidden descent provides an easy answer. Yet heredity itself already carries enough mystery without secret species. Every person is connected to countless unknown ancestors. Names disappear after a few generations, faces survive briefly in photographs or paintings, then vanish. Genetic inheritance continues even when family memory fails. You carry traces of people whose stories you will never know. That ordinary fact can feel stranger than fantasy. Human identity is already layered with invisible histories. Language and customs, fears, gestures, and inherited traits pass through time without announcing their origins. In that sense, the past does walk among the living, though not through disguised immortals. Perhaps the most persistent watcher is memory itself. Ancient societies watch modern readers through what they leave behind: a carved eye, a written oath, a royal name, or a protective figure crosses thousands of years and still directs attention. You look at the object, but in a strange reversal, the object seems to look back. Museums heighten this sensation. Glass separates you from a face carved by someone who died long ago. The eyes are fixed, yet they hold attention. You know the figure cannot see, but the mind responds to faces automatically. The ancient object becomes a silent observer simply because human perception is built to recognize gaze. The idea of watchers therefore survives because it joins several powerful human instincts. You fear unseen judgment. You search for agency behind uncertainty. You wonder whether appearances deceive. You project present anxieties into ancient symbols. You also hope, perhaps, that humanity is important enough for someone to notice. That hope is rarely discussed. Being watched can feel threatening, but complete cosmic indifference can feel colder. A watcher implies attention. Attention implies significance. Even a disturbing observer confirms that human life matters to something beyond itself. Night deepens around the imagined city. Windows go dark one by one. Streets empty. The sky remains vast above rooftops. Rivers, deserts, and ruins. No hidden figure needs to appear. The possibility is enough. Perhaps that is why these stories endure. They're not only about secret beings, they're about the human discomfort with being alone in history. You look backward into ancient darkness and wonder whether someone was watching then. You look around the modern world and wonder whether anyone watches now. The oldest tablets do not answer that question, but they preserve a world in which unseen attention felt entirely possible. What remains behind the clay is not a solved secret, but a pattern of human memory preserved against extraordinary odds. 8 primeval rulers stand within that pattern, surrounded by divine authority, immense chronology, sacred wisdom, and catastrophe. Their names survive because scribes believed they belonged inside the architecture of the past. Their precise identities remain harder to recover. You can approach them through archaeology, mythology, political history, mathematics, and ritual tradition, yet each path reveals only part of the landscape. You imagine a clay tablet resting beneath museum glass while footsteps move softly through the gallery. Its surface appears brown, cracked, and almost disappointingly ordinary. Nothing glows beneath the lights. No hidden mechanism waits inside it. The signs remain exactly where an ancient hand pressed them, arranged in lines that once seemed perfectly intelligible to trained readers. Thousands of years have changed the world around the object, but the pressure of the stylus survives. That survival is remarkable in itself. Empires built palaces intended to proclaim permanence, yet many disappeared into ruined foundations. Armies marched beneath banners whose colours are forgotten. Kings erected monuments to protect their names, only to become uncertain figures reconstructed from fragments. Clay, one of the cheapest materials in ancient Mesopotamia, often outlasted them. The humble writing surface became a better guardian of memory than bronze gates or royal ambition. Archaeology confirms that southern Mesopotamia supported some of the earliest known urban societies, complete with temples, specialized labor, administration, trade, and increasingly complex systems of writing. Excavated settlements reveal ordinary human lives behind the monumental stories. People repaired houses, cooked meals, raised children, recorded debts, brewed drinks, managed animals, and worried about harvests. The supernatural traditions emerged within this practical world rather than floating apart from it. That contrast matters. The same civilization that carefully measured grain could imagine rulers reigning for impossible spans. The same scribes who recorded legal agreements could copy stories involving divine assemblies and primeval wisdom. Ancient people did not necessarily experience contradiction between careful administration and sacred imagination. Both offered ways to organize uncertainty. You can smell bread baking in a courtyard while someone nearby recites a story about the gods. A child listens without separating folklore from theology. An official carries a tablet containing exact quantities of barley while wearing an amulet against unseen danger. Practical knowledge and sacred meaning share the same street. Modern habits often demand that one must replace the other. Ancient life frequently allowed them to coexist. A curious fringe claim insists that this coexistence proves ancient people were describing technology they lacked the vocabulary to understand. According to that interpretation, gods become visitors, divine knowledge becomes advanced science, and extraordinary rulers become long-lived non-human administrators. The theory offers an elegant answer because nearly every mystery can fit inside it. Yet an explanation that can absorb everything also risks explaining nothing without direct evidence. Flexibility becomes impossible to test. The older material does not need such certainty to remain compelling. The mystery is already substantial. Why did scribes preserve a primeval royal sequence on such enormous scales? Why did sacred knowledge become attached to ancient sages? Why did divine power appear through several forms, rather than one fixed representation? Why did catastrophe mark such a dramatic boundary in remembered time? These questions arise directly from the surviving traditions. Scholars continue to disagree about how much genuine historical memory may lie beneath the legendary layers. Some features could preserve traces of early political competition between cities. Others may have been created to express theological ideas about legitimate authority. Numerical structures may contain symbolic meaning, whose exact logic has been lost. The origins of individual names may reach into traditions older than the manuscripts preserving them. Uncertainty remains because the evidence does not allow every layer to be separated cleanly. This is not unusual in ancient history. The deeper you travel into the earliest written periods, the more fragile distinctions become. Archaeology can recover material remains without telling you exactly what stories people attach to them. Texts can preserve stories without proving every event physically occurred. Later copies can retain ancient names while reshaping their meaning. History becomes reconstruction rather than simple retrieval. You feel rough clay beneath imagined fingertips and understand why certainty should remain modest. Every sign represents survival, but survival is selective. Most conversations vanished. Most songs disappeared. Most personal memories ended with the people who carried them. The tablets preserve what institutions considered worth writing. Not everything the society knew. This diluence creates another important possibility. The mystery may not concern beings hidden from humanity. It may concern meanings hidden from us because the cultural world that produced them no longer exists. An ancient reader may have recognized associations immediately that modern scholars can only approach indirectly. What feels deliberately secret today may once have been completely ordinary. A number might have carried a familiar symbolic value. A name might have recalled a myth everyone knew. A city might evoke a religious tradition requiring no explanation. And the scribe leaves these associations unstated because his audience already understands them. Thousands of years later, that shared knowledge is gone, and the silence looks mysterious. Perhaps this is the disguise that time creates. It covers familiar things with unfamiliarity. A ritual object becomes strange because its ceremony is forgotten. A sacred title becomes cryptic because its social role has vanished. A mythic ruler becomes an unexplained being because modern language cannot reproduce the category neatly. Nothing intentionally hides. Context simply disappears. You walk in imagination through a ruined Mesopotamian settlement at twilight. Wind moves over low mounds where houses once stood. Broken pottery lies beneath the soil. A narrow trench exposes layers of rebuilding. each representing generations who believed their own present was permanent. Above everything stretches the same broad sky that those communities watched while interpreting stars, storms, and seasonal changes. There is humility in that landscape. Civilizations can become archaeological layers. Languages can become academic specialties. Gods once served by thousands can become names discussed in quiet libraries. Political systems that seemed eternal can survive only as formulas pressed into clay. The 8 rulers belong to this deep erosion of meaning. They remain visible enough to provoke questions, yet distant enough to resist complete recovery. You know the structure surrounding them. You know how scribes preserve their sequence. You know something about the religious and political culture capable of imagining such figures, but you do not know every intention behind the list. That limitation protects the story from becoming too simple. There is no need to declare that 8 disguised watchers secretly ruled humanity. There is also no need to reduce the tradition to meaningless fantasy. Between those extremes lies something richer. Ancient people built a memory of the world in which authority reached beyond ordinary human time. Knowledge descended through sacred channels, and civilization existed beneath forces larger than itself. You stand quietly before the surviving clay and allow that older worldview to remain unfamiliar. It does not have to become modern science. It does not have to become a conspiracy. It can remain what it was, a complex attempt to place human society inside a universe filled with divine order, fragile cities, uncertain rivers, and memories of beginnings no living person could verify. Perhaps the 8 rulers are most powerful precisely because they cannot be brought fully into the light. Their names survive, but their faces do not. Their reigns are measured, but their nature remains uncertain. Their cities can be studied, yet the sacred atmosphere surrounding them must be reconstructed from scattered evidence. And perhaps the hidden truth is gentler than the stories of disguised observers suggest. Human beings have always inherited fragments from people who came earlier. Each generation tries to arrange those fragments into meaning. Sometimes the reconstruction becomes history, sometimes it becomes myth, sometimes it becomes both at once. The clay remains shunned beneath the museum lights. Visitors move past it, carrying different questions. One sees a historical document, another sees sacred literature, another sees evidence of forgotten knowledge. The tablet accepts every gaze without confirming any of them. And perhaps the story is not yet complete. The lights grow softer now, and the ancient cities begin to recede into darkness. You no longer need to follow every name or number. Let the details loosen their grip while the image of the old river plain remains. Reeds move gently beside dark water. Warm air passes over walls made from earth. Somewhere beneath layers of soil, forgotten rooms rest quietly where families once slept. Nothing is asking you for an answer tonight. The 8 names can remain where they have survived for thousands of years. Pressed carefully into clay, their impossible reigns do not need to be solved before morning. Their cities do not need to rise again. The sages, priests, guardians, rulers, and gods can return to the half-light from which history briefly brought them forward. Perhaps that is the kindest way to leave the ancient world, not by forcing certainty upon it, but by allowing distance to remain. Some questions endure because the evidence is incomplete. Others endure because human imagination keeps returning to them. And some endure simply because the past is larger than anything that survives from it. You can let the river move quietly now. The water reflects a few stars, then carries their light away. Far beyond the vanished temples, the horizon becomes almost invisible. Nothing watches from the reeds, nothing follows your steps. There is only night, soft winds, and the long silence of places that have outlived every voice once heard within them. Perhaps another tablet still lies beneath the earth. Perhaps another broken line waits in a museum drawer. Perhaps nothing more will ever appear. Either possibility is enough. The story can remain unfinished. And perhaps, somewhere between history and memory, that was always its proper ending. Good night,